Welcome back to the Haunted Fears horror family. Tonight we're diving deep into the mountains of Appalachia, where isolation isn't just lonely, it's dangerous. 11 people found themselves completely alone in places where help is miles away, and something in the darkness knew it. What started as creaking floors and strange sounds turned into nights they'll never forget. Each story gets darker than the last. Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Hit that subscribe button, because you won't want to miss what happened to these people when they realized they weren't really alone. What would you do if you discovered someone had been living beneath your feet, watching you through the cracks in your floorboards, studying your every move for weeks? By the time I found out, it was almost too late. My name is Hazel Thompson, and I'm 28 years old. What happened to me in our cabin outside Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, changed everything about how I see the world. I used to think I was a rational person, someone who didn't scare easily. I was wrong. Some fears are justified, and some nightmares are real. My husband Zane and I had bought the cabin about 6 months before this happened. It was a dream property for us. Remote, surrounded by woods, with a view of the Shenandoah River Valley from the back porch. The nearest neighbor was almost 2 miles down a winding dirt road. We loved the isolation. We thought it was peaceful. Looking back, I realize how vulnerable that isolation made us. Zane traveled for work occasionally, usually just overnight trips. But in late September, his company sent him to a 3-day conference in Charleston. I'd been alone in the cabin plenty of times before, so neither of us thought twice about it. He left on a Thursday morning, kissing me goodbye and joking that I'd probably enjoy the peace and quiet. I remember laughing and telling him to drive safe. That was the last moment before everything changed. The first night alone was unremarkable until about 2 in the morning. I woke up suddenly, that jarring kind of wake-up where you're instantly alert but don't know why. Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps on our wooden porch. They were deliberate, slow, circling around the front of the house. My first thought was that it might be a bear. We'd seen them in the area before, and they sometimes got curious about houses. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the footsteps make a complete circuit of the porch before finally stopping. After about 10 minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was just an animal and went back to sleep. The second night, things escalated. I was reading in bed around 1:30 when I heard loud, deliberate knocking on the front door. Not frantic knocking like someone in distress. Slow, measured knocks, 3 of them, spaced evenly apart. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed my phone and the flashlight we kept on the nightstand, then crept down the hallway toward the living room. The knocking had stopped. I stood there in the darkness for a full 5 minutes, barely breathing, listening. Nothing. Finally, I worked up the courage to turn on the porch light and look out the window. The porch was empty. But when I opened the front door to check, I saw them. Fresh, muddy boot prints on the porch steps. They were large, definitely made by a man's work boot, and they led up to the door, then back down again, disappearing into the grass. The mud was still wet. Whoever had been there had left just moments before. I locked every door and window in the house, checked them, twice, and didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the living room with all the lights on and a kitchen knife in my lap until the sun came up. I called Zane the next morning, and I could hear the concern in his voice. He offered to come home early, but I told him not to. It was his last day of the conference, and I felt foolish admitting how terrified I was. I convinced myself that maybe it was just some lost hiker or a drunk person who'd gotten confused. The explanation didn't feel right, but I needed it to be true. The third night broke me. I'd been jumpy all evening, checking the locks obsessively, looking out the windows every few minutes. Around 11, I finally forced myself to go to bed. I was lying there in the darkness when I heard breathing outside the bedroom window. Not heavy panting, but slow measured breaths, like someone standing very still and very close to the glass. The window was only about 5 feet off the ground. Someone could easily stand right there and look in. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I just lay there, frozen, listening to someone breathe on the other side of that thin pane of glass. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Then the breathing stopped, and I heard footsteps moving away, walking around the side of the house. I heard them at the living room window, then the kitchen window, then the bathroom window. Someone was checking every single window in our house. When I finally got the courage to look, I saw them. Greasy handprints on every window. Smeared, grimy prints like someone had pressed their palms against the glass and dragged them down slowly. Someone had been checking each window, testing them, touching them. I grabbed my phone and almost called the police, but what would I say? Someone knocked on my door and touched my windows. I had no proof they were still there. I had no proof of anything except my own terror. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of my bedroom with my phone in my hand until the sun came up. The fourth morning, I went outside in daylight to look around. That's when I found them in the mailbox, a stack of Polaroid photographs, maybe 20 of them, held together with a rubber band. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped them. They were all photos of our cabin, taken at night, from different angles around the property. Some were taken from the woods behind the house. Some were taken from the driveway. One was taken from right outside our bedroom window. I could see our bed through the glass, the angle exactly where I'd heard the breathing. And in several of the photos, there were dark shapes, shadowy figures standing in the background, barely visible, but definitely there. Someone had been photographing our house for weeks, maybe months. Someone had been watching us. I called Zane immediately, hysteria finally breaking through. He left Charleston right then, cutting his last meeting short. While I waited for him, I couldn't stay in the house. I sat in my car in the driveway with the doors locked, watching the cabin like it had betrayed me. It took Zane 4 hours to get home, 4 hours of me sitting there, staring at those photographs, trying to understand who would do this and why. When Zane arrived, he was furious and scared in equal measure. He grabbed a flashlight and a tire iron from the garage and said he was going to check the crawlspace. Our cabin was built on a foundation with about 3 feet of clearance underneath. There was an access panel on the side of the house, secured with a simple latch. We'd never actually gone down there. It was just dirt and spider webs and foundation supports. Zane pried open the access panel and shone his flashlight into the darkness. Then he went very still. "Hazel," he said, his voice tight and strange. "Call the police right now." I called while he backed away from the opening. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, they went down into the crawlspace with flashlights and cameras. What they found made my skin crawl. Someone had been living under our house. There was a sleeping bag spread out on a flattened piece of cardboard. Empty food containers, granola bar wrappers, water bottles, fast food bags. A battery-powered camping lantern, and dozens more Polaroid photographs. Photos of me, through the windows, me cooking dinner, me reading on the couch, me asleep in bed. Some of the photos were taken from inside the crawlspace, shooting upward through gaps in the floorboards, in our bedroom, in our bathroom, everywhere. The police told us the person had been accessing the space beneath our house for weeks, maybe longer. They could hear everything we said. They could watch us through the cracks. They knew our routines, our schedules. They knew when Zane left for work. They knew when I was alone. The police collected everything as evidence. They found DNA, fingerprints, footprints in the dirt. But they never identified who it was. The prints didn't match anyone in the system. The DNA led nowhere. Whoever had been living under our house was a ghost as far as the law was concerned. We moved out that same day, didn't even pack properly, just threw everything we could grab into our cars and left. We stayed with Zane's parents for 2 weeks while we looked for a new place, somewhere in town, somewhere with neighbors close by. We sold the cabin within a month, taking a loss on it just to be rid of it. I didn't care about the money. I cared about never going back there. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake at night. We never saw him. Not once. Not even when the police were there, collecting evidence. He'd been living under our house for weeks, watching us, photographing us, learning everything about us, and we never saw him. Not his face, not his car, nothing. For all I know, I could pass him on the street tomorrow and never know it was him. I'm different now. I check under every house I visit. I look in crawl spaces, and basements, and attics. I don't trust isolation anymore. When people tell me about their beautiful remote cabins or their peaceful country homes, all I can think about is how easy it would be for someone to watch them, to study them, to live in the spaces they don't think to check. Because that's what I learned in Harper's Ferry. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you can see. It's what's been there all along, just beneath your feet, watching and waiting in the darkness you never thought to look at. Have you ever felt like you were intruding in your own home, like something there resented your very presence? I inherited a house that came with more than just memories. It came with someone who refused to leave. My name is Benson Clark, and I'm 45 years old. I'm an accountant, a practical man who built his career on numbers, logic, and reason. I never believed in ghosts or spirits or anything I couldn't quantify on a spreadsheet. That all changed during one week in October, when I stayed alone in my inherited farmhouse outside Hazard, Kentucky, in the hills near Troublesome Creek. What happened there defied every rational explanation I'd spent my life relying on. My Uncle Clarence Boone died 2 years before I inherited his property. He was my mother's older brother, a man I'd only met a handful of times growing up. He was a quiet, stubborn man who'd lived alone in that 2-story farmhouse for over 30 years after his wife passed. When he died, the property sat empty for almost 2 years while the estate went through probate. There were complications, distant relatives contesting the will, unpaid taxes, legal issues. By the time everything was settled and the house officially became mine, it had been vacant for a long time. My wife Dorothy and our 2 teenagers weren't thrilled about the idea of moving to rural Kentucky, even temporarily. We lived in Lexington, where the kids had school and friends, and Dorothy had her job at the hospital. But the house was paid off, and we were drowning in debt. The plan was simple. I'd spend a few weeks fixing up the farmhouse, we'd sell it, and use the money to get back on our feet. Dorothy and the kids would stay with their parents in Lexington while I worked on the house. I'd come back on weekends. It seemed straightforward. I arrived at the farmhouse on a Sunday afternoon in mid-October. The place looked tired. Peeling paint, overgrown yard, shutters hanging crooked. But the bones were good, and the inside was cleaner than I'd expected. Uncle Clarence's furniture was still there, covered in dust but intact. Family photos still hung on the walls. It felt less like an empty house, and more like someone had just stepped out and never come back. The first evening was quiet. I spent it taking inventory, making lists of repairs, measuring rooms. Around 8 o'clock, I was in the living room reviewing my notes when the old tube radio on the bookshelf suddenly clicked on. I hadn't touched it. Hadn't even noticed it was plugged in. Static poured out of the speakers, loud and harsh in the quiet house. Then, underneath the static, I heard singing. Children's voices, high and clear, singing an old folk song I vaguely recognized from childhood. In the pines, where the sun don't ever shine. I walked over and turned the dial, but the singing continued at the same volume, regardless of the station. Finally, I just unplugged it. The singing stopped immediately, leaving the house in thick silence. I told myself it was just an old radio acting up, possibly wired wrong, some kind of electrical issue. I made a note to check the wiring and went back to my work. That night, I slept in my uncle's old bedroom upstairs. The bed was comfortable enough once I'd put fresh sheets on it, and I was exhausted from the drive and the work. I fell asleep quickly, but around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of the radio playing again downstairs. Same static, same children singing. But I'd unplugged it. I was sure I'd unplugged it. I went downstairs with my phone flashlight and found the radio still unplugged, cord lying on the floor, but the singing was definitely coming from it somehow, impossibly. I picked up the entire radio and carried it out to my truck, locking it in the truck bed. When I came back inside, the house was silent. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe there was another radio somewhere in the house. Maybe the wiring was so old that it was picking up signals somehow. I spent Monday focused on work, measuring for new drywall, checking the foundation, making calls to contractors. I was determined to treat this like any other project. Systematic, logical, solvable. That afternoon, I needed to check the basement. I'd been avoiding it because basements in old houses tend to be unpleasant, damp, dark, full of spiders. But I needed to inspect the furnace and the electrical panel. The basement door was at the back of the kitchen, a heavy wooden door with an old-fashioned latch. When I opened it and started down the stairs, I noticed something odd. There were scratch marks on the inside of the door, deep gouges in the wood, concentrated around the handle area, like someone had been clawing at it from the basement side, trying to get out. The scratches were old, the wood gray and weathered where it had been torn, but they were unmistakable. I stood there on the basement stairs, staring at those marks, trying to come up with an explanation. An animal. But how would an animal get trapped down there? And these didn't look like animal scratches. They were too deliberate, too focused on the mechanism of the latch. I forced myself to continue down into the basement. It was exactly as unpleasant as I'd expected. Low ceiling, concrete floor, shadows everywhere my flashlight didn't reach. The furnace was old but functional. The electrical panel looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, which explained a lot. I was making notes when I heard footsteps upstairs. Heavy, deliberate footsteps walking across the living room floor directly above my head. My blood went cold. I was alone in this house. I knew I was alone. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, but someone was walking around up there. I could hear it clearly. The distinctive creak of the old floorboards, the sound of weight shifting from one step to another. The footsteps crossed the living room, went down the hallway, then seemed to stop near the bedrooms. I crept up the basement stairs as quietly as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. When I emerged into the kitchen, the house was empty, completely silent, no one there. But when I walked into the living room, I saw that all the family photographs on the walls had been turned face down. Every single one. Photos of my uncle, my mother as a child, old wedding pictures, everything. All carefully turned around so the images faced the wall. I hadn't touched them. No one had been in the house, but someone, something, had gone around the room and turned every photograph face down. My hands were shaking as I turned them back around, and I noticed my uncle's face in particular, in a photo that must have been taken a few years before he died. He looked angry in that picture, his jaw set, his eyes hard. I'd never really looked at it closely before. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep upstairs. I lay on the couch with all the lights on, telling myself I'd leave in the morning, forget this whole thing, let the bank take the house. But I must have dozed off eventually because I woke suddenly around 2 a.m. to the sound of furniture moving upstairs. Dragging sounds, heavy scraping like someone was rearranging an entire room. I sat frozen on that couch, listening to it go on for nearly 20 minutes. When it finally stopped, I couldn't make myself go up there to check. I just sat in the living room until dawn, watching the stairs, waiting for something to come down. When the sun finally came up, I forced myself to go upstairs. The bedroom where I'd slept that first night, my uncle's room, had been completely rearranged. The bed was pushed against the opposite wall. The dresser had been moved to where the bed had been. The nightstand was on the other side. Someone had physically moved every piece of heavy furniture in that room during the night. The layout was completely different. I should have left right then, but I was angry now, frustrated by my own fear. I called Dorothy and told her something was wrong with the house. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't want her to think I was losing my mind. but I said I was experiencing strange things. She suggested I call one of the neighbors, maybe the Hendersons who lived down the road, ask them about the house's history. Miller Henderson was in his 70s, a lifelong resident of the area. When I asked him about my uncle and the farmhouse, his expression changed. He got very quiet, then invited me to sit on his porch. What he told me made everything click into place. My uncle hadn't died in the farmhouse. 2 months before his death, his health had declined rapidly. He'd developed dementia and could no longer care for himself. His nephew, my cousin Philip, who'd contested the will, had him removed from the home and placed in a nursing facility in Hazard against his will. Uncle Clarence had been furious, combative, insisting he wanted to die in his own home. But he wasn't legally competent to make that decision, so they'd taken him anyway. He died in that nursing home 6 weeks later. Miller said my uncle had talked about nothing but getting back to his house, getting back home. He'd tried to escape the facility 3 times. They'd had to put him in a locked ward. He'd died angry, desperate to return to the only place he'd ever wanted to be. Clarence loved that house more than anything, Miller told me. Losing it broke something in him. He died trying to find his way back. I sat there on Miller's porch processing this. The scratches on the basement door. The furniture moved back to where it used to be. The photographs turned face down, maybe because he didn't want to see his own face, the face of a man who'd been taken from his home. The radio playing songs from his childhood. It wasn't random haunting. It was grief and anger and a desperate need to reclaim what had been taken. I went back to the farmhouse that afternoon with a different perspective. I stood in the living room and spoke out loud, feeling foolish but committed. Uncle Clarence, if you're here, I understand. They shouldn't have moved you out. This was your home. I'm sorry that happened to you. The house was silent. I walked upstairs to the bedroom and looked at the rearranged furniture. I'm going to put everything back the way you had it, I said. I'm not going to sell this house to strangers. It's yours. It's always been yours. I spent the next hour moving the furniture back exactly as I'd found it when I first arrived. I went through old photos and found pictures of the room from years ago, making sure every detail was correct. The nightstand by the window, the bed facing the door, the dresser against the north wall. I put it all back. That night, the house was completely quiet. No radio, no footsteps, no furniture moving, just peaceful silence. I slept through the night for the first time since I'd arrived. The next morning, I called Dorothy and told her we weren't selling the house. We'd rent it out, or we'd keep it in the family, but we wouldn't sell it to strangers. She thought I was crazy, taking on property we couldn't afford to maintain. But I'd made my decision. I stayed 3 more days to finish the basic repairs, and nothing else happened. The house felt different now, not menacing, just watchful. Like my uncle was satisfied that his home wouldn't be taken away again. On my last morning there, I found the radio back on the bookshelf, plugged in. I hadn't brought it back from my truck, but it was there, in its place, where it belonged. I still own that farmhouse. We rent it to a local family who needed an affordable place, and I told them about Uncle Clarence, about what happened. They say they've never had any problems. The house is peaceful now. Sometimes they hear footsteps at night, but they don't feel threatened. They say it feels like someone checking on things, making sure everything's okay. I learned something in that house in Hazard. Sometimes the dead don't move on because they're not done. Sometimes they stay because they love something so much they can't let it go. And sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let them have what they need. Not peace, not rest, but home. What would you do if you woke up to find your home surrounded by symbols meant for something dark, something that had been waiting for you? I learned that some places in Appalachia remember rituals that should have been forgotten. My name is Skylar Chen, and I'm 19 years old. What happened to me in the woods outside Gatlinburg, Tennessee, changed how I see the world, especially the deep forest at the base of the Smoky Mountains. I used to think the scariest things in life were student loans and bad grades. I was naive. Sometimes the scariest things are the ones that have been in the mountains longer than any of us, waiting in the shadows between the trees. I lived with my parents in a single wide trailer about 15 minutes outside Gatlinburg proper. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. The trailer sat on 2 acres of wooded land that my dad had bought cheap years ago. Dense forest surrounded us on 3 sides, and our nearest neighbor was about half a mile down the dirt road. My parents loved the privacy. I'd grown up there, so the isolation felt normal to me. I never thought about how vulnerable we were out there, how cut off from help. In early October, my grandmother had emergency surgery in Knoxville. It was serious, a brain aneurysm that required immediate intervention. My parents rushed to the hospital and ended up staying there for 2 nights while she recovered. They asked if I wanted to come with them, but I had classes at the community college and a shift at my job at the tourist shop in town. I told them I'd be fine alone. I was 19, not a child. I'd stayed alone before. Besides, we had our 2 dogs, Samson and Rain, both mutts we'd rescued years ago. They were protective and loud, and having them there made me feel safer. That first night alone was completely normal. I did homework, watched Netflix, fed the dogs. Everything was fine until around 11 p.m. when both dogs started going crazy. They were outside in the yard, which was usual for that time of night before I brought them in for bed. But suddenly they started barking frantically, both of them focused on the same spot at the tree line behind the trailer. Not their normal barking at a raccoon or deer. This was aggressive, territorial barking mixed with low growls that raised the hair on my arms. I turned on the back porch light and called them, but they wouldn't come. They just kept barking at the trees, pacing back and forth along the same line like they were guarding against something. I finally had to go out and physically grab their collars to drag them inside. The whole time they kept looking back at the woods, growling deep in their chests. Once I got them in the trailer, they wouldn't settle down. They paced from window to window, whining and growling. This went on until almost 3 in the morning. I barely slept, listening to them patrol the trailer, watching them stare out into the darkness. When the sun came up, I let them out to do their business. They immediately ran to the tree line, barking again, but differently now, more confused than aggressive. I grabbed my jacket and followed them to see what had them so worked up. What I found made my stomach drop. Hanging from the branches of the trees surrounding our property were dozens of stick figures. Not random sticks that had fallen. These were deliberately constructed, bound together with what looked like dried grass or twine. They were all roughly the same size, about a foot tall, and they were all hanging at eye level, spinning slowly in the morning breeze. And every single one of them was facing our trailer. I counted 23 of them, forming a rough circle around our clearing. The sticks looked freshly cut. The ends were still pale where they'd been broken. Someone had made these recently and hung them here during the night while I'd been inside, while my dogs had been barking. Someone had been in our woods, surrounding our home. I called my parents immediately, my voice shaking. My dad told me to call the police, which I did, but when the sheriff's deputy arrived an hour later, he didn't seem particularly concerned. He walked around, looked at the stick figures, took a few photos. He said it was probably just teenagers messing around trying to scare people with Blair Witch Project-type pranks. He took down a few of the figures as evidence and told me to call if anything else happened. But I could tell he was uncomfortable. The way he kept looking at the trees, the way he hurried back to his car. He knew something he wasn't saying. That night was worse. My parents were still in Knoxville. My grandmother had developed complications and they needed to stay another night. I considered getting a hotel room in town, but I couldn't afford it, and I didn't want to abandon our home or the dogs. I brought Samson and Rain inside before dark and locked every door and window. Around 9 p.m. I heard it. Chanting. Multiple voices coming from deep in the woods, rhythmic and low. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence was deliberate, ceremonial. The dogs went berserk, barking and scratching at the door. The chanting continued for maybe 20 minutes, never getting closer but never fading either. Then suddenly, both dogs went completely silent. They stopped barking, stopped pacing. They just tucked their tails and crawled under the kitchen table, whimpering. I'd never seen them act like that. These were dogs that barked at delivery trucks and chased bears out of our yard. But now they were hiding, trembling, refusing to even look at the windows. I was terrified, but also angry. Someone was on our property, deliberately trying to scare me. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, then went to the back window. That's when I saw them. There were at least 6 figures standing in the woods, maybe 8. They wore dark robes or cloaks, hoods pulled up. They stood in a circle around something I couldn't see, and each one held a candle. The tiny flames flickered in the darkness like stars. They were maybe 50 yards into the trees, just visible in the ambient light from the trailer. As I watched, frozen at the window, they all turned simultaneously to face the trailer. Not gradually, all at once, like they'd been given a signal. 8 hooded figures, all facing me, standing perfectly still. The chanting had stopped. They just stood there in complete silence, watching. I dropped to the floor, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. I crawled away from the window and called 911, whispering frantically to the dispatcher. She said she was sending deputies immediately, that I should stay inside and stay away from the windows. It took 20 minutes for the police to arrive. 20 minutes of me hiding in the bathroom with the dogs, listening for any sound of movement outside. When I finally heard the sirens and saw the blue lights flashing through the windows, I almost cried with relief. But when the deputies searched the woods with their flashlights and dogs, they found nothing. No people, no robes, no candles. What they did find made everything worse. Carved into the trees around our property were symbols, crude markings cut into the bark, circles with lines through them, crosses with extra bars, patterns I didn't recognize. The carvings were old. The bark had healed around them in places. They'd been there for years, maybe decades. One of the deputies, an older man named Aiden Morrison, pulled me aside. "How long have you folks lived here?" he asked. "My whole life. 17 years. He looked uncomfortable. "This land, before your parents bought it, did they tell you what was here?" "Just woods. It was empty land." He shook his head. "Not empty. There was a structure here, long time ago. Got torn down in the early 2000s. The folks who lived here, they were involved in some things. Old mountain practices, rituals, the kind of stuff that goes way back, before churches, before laws." "What kind of rituals?" "The kind that don't stop just because the people die or move away. The kind that get remembered by others who believe in them." He looked at the symbols carved in the trees. Your trailer's sitting right in the middle of what used to be their meeting ground. These symbols, they mark it. And some folks around here, they still honor the old ways. I felt sick. "Are you saying we built our home on some kind of ritual site?" "I'm saying you might want to consider staying somewhere else for a while, at least until your parents get back." I didn't need to be told twice. I packed a bag, loaded the dogs in my car, and drove straight to my friend Willow's apartment in town. I didn't go back to the trailer until my parents returned 2 days later. When I told them everything, they didn't believe me at first. But then Dad found more symbols. He went deeper into the woods than the police had and found the remains of a fire pit, candle wax on rocks, more stick figures, hanging in trees farther out. He talked to some of the old-timers in the area, people who'd lived in those mountains their whole lives. What he learned made us decide to move. There had been a group practicing in those woods for generations. Some kind of mountain cult that blended old Appalachian folk magic with other things, darker things. They'd had a building on our land where they'd meet. When it got torn down and the land sold, they'd supposedly disbanded. But apparently, some of them still considered that ground sacred. They still came back to perform rituals, especially around certain times of year. And we'd built our home right in the center of their circle. We moved out within 3 weeks. My parents sold the land at a loss to a developer who planned to clear it for a storage facility. I don't know if they ever built it. I don't know if those people still go back there. I don't want to know. What I learned in those woods outside Gatlinburg is that some places hold on to their past. The land remembers what happened on it, and some people never stop honoring those memories, no matter who else moves in. We were trespassers in a space that had been claimed long before we arrived. And when you're young and alone and surrounded by darkness, there's no reasoning with people who believe you're standing on their sacred ground. I still have nightmares about those hooded figures turning to face me all at once, silent and watching. I wake up thinking about how close I came to following those voices deeper into the woods, to stepping outside when they wanted me to, because I think that's what the stick figures were for, not to scare me away, but to mark me, to include me in whatever circle they were drawing. I got lucky. I stayed inside. I called for help, but I'll never forget standing at that window, watching them watch me, knowing that out there in the deep Appalachian woods, some people never stop practicing the old ways, and some rituals never really end. What happens when grief makes you so desperate that you can't tell the difference between a blessing and a curse? I learned that some things know exactly how to use our love against us. My name is Rocco Hayes, and I'm 62 years old. I've lived in the mountains of North Carolina my whole life, working as a carpenter and building a quiet existence with my wife of 37 years. When Autumn passed away from cancer 6 months ago, I thought the hardest part of my life was over. I was wrong. The hardest part was what came after when something that wasn't her tried to come back. Our home sits on a ridge outside Asheville, overlooking a valley that Autumn used to paint. She was an artist, spent hours on our back deck capturing the way the morning fog settled between the hills. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to move any of her things. Her easel stayed on the deck. Her reading glasses remained on her nightstand. Her coffee mug sat in the cabinet in the spot she'd kept it for decades. Our children, Lyric and Salem, both grown and living out of state, urged me to start packing up her belongings, said it would help me move forward. But I wasn't ready. The house felt less empty with her things still in it. The first time I heard her voice was about 2 weeks after the funeral. I was in the kitchen making dinner, and I heard her call my name from the living room. "Rocco," she said, clear as day, in that particular tone she used when she wanted to show me something. My heart stopped. I stood there frozen with a knife in my hand, telling myself I'd imagined it. Grief playing tricks on my mind. I'd read about that, how the bereaved sometimes hear their loved ones' voices. It's normal, I told myself. It doesn't mean anything. But then it happened again the next day. I was in the garage, and I heard her humming. She had this habit of humming hymns while she worked around the house, usually Amazing Grace, or How Great Thou Art. I heard it clearly coming from inside, that same slightly off-key humming I'd listened to for 37 years. I went inside, following the sound, but it stopped the moment I opened the door. I started finding things moved. Small things at first. Her reading glasses would be on my nightstand instead of hers. Her favorite coffee mug would be sitting on the counter, even though I knew I hadn't touched it. A book she'd been reading was left open on the couch, marked to a different page than where I'd last seen it. Each time, I told myself I was misremembering, that grief was affecting my memory. But deep down, a part of me hoped. Hoped that maybe she was still here somehow, still with me. The hoping is what made me vulnerable to what came next. It was a Thursday evening, about 3 weeks after I'd first heard her voice. I was sitting in the living room watching television, not really paying attention, when I saw her reflection in the window. The TV was reflecting in the glass, and behind my own reflection, I saw her, Autumn, standing in the doorway behind me, wearing the blue cardigan she'd loved. I spun around so fast I nearly fell out of the chair. Nothing there, just the empty doorway. But I'd seen her. I know I'd seen her. My hands were shaking as I walked over to where she'd been standing. The air felt different there, cooler somehow. I stood in that spot for a long time, waiting, hoping she'd appear again. "Autumn," I said aloud, feeling foolish but desperate. "If that's you, if you're still here, please, Let me know. I miss you so much." The house was silent. I waited, but nothing happened. I finally went to bed, emotionally exhausted, telling myself it had been a trick of the light, nothing more. That night, I woke up around 2 in the morning. The house was dark and quiet, but I had the overwhelming sensation that someone was in the room with me. I could feel it, that awareness you get when you're not alone. I lay there in the darkness, too afraid to move, barely breathing. Then I heard it, her humming, right there in the bedroom with me. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The melody was unmistakable. I reached over and turned on the lamp. The room was empty, but the humming continued for a few more bars before fading away. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding with a strange mixture of fear and hope. Was this real? Was she really still here? Over the next few days, the activity increased. I'd hear her voice more frequently, always from another room, always saying my name or humming. Items would be moved more obviously, her art supplies arranged on the deck like she was about to start painting, the television turned to channels she used to watch, her side of the bed with the covers pulled back like someone had been lying there. I stopped fighting it. I started talking to her, telling her about my day, sharing things like I used to when she was alive. It felt good, comforting even. I wasn't alone anymore. My children called and asked how I was doing, and I lied, told them I was fine. I didn't tell them about Autumn because I knew what they'd say. They'd think grief had broken something in my mind. Maybe it had. I didn't care. Then one evening, I was in the kitchen when I clearly heard her humming from the living room. I walked in, and there she was. Not a reflection, not a glimpse. She was standing by the window, looking out at the valley, humming her hymn. She looked exactly as I remembered, down to the way she stood with her weight on one hip, her head tilted slightly. "Margaret," I said without thinking. She turned around, and that's when everything changed. Her face was Autumn's face, but something about it was wrong. The smile was too wide, stretched just a bit too far. Her eyes were Autumn's brown eyes, but they didn't crinkle at the corners the way they should. She looked at me with an expression that was almost right, but not quite. "I've missed you, Rocco," she said in Autumn's voice. But I'd called her Margaret, and she'd responded. My wife's name was Autumn. I'd never called her anything else in 37 years. Margaret was my mother's name. The mistake had been automatic, a slip of the tongue in my shock. But Autumn would have corrected me. She would have laughed or looked confused. This thing just accepted it. "You," I started, my throat tight. "You're not her." The smile didn't fade. "Of course I am. I'm right here." "What was our first dance song?" I asked suddenly. "At our wedding." She tilted her head, and for a moment something flickered across her face. Confusion, maybe, or calculation. "Our song," she said slowly. "The one we always loved." "What song?" I pressed. "You know the one," she said. And that smile was back. That wrong smile. I did know. It was Unchained Melody. Autumn had insisted on it. She'd loved that song since she was a teenager. This thing should have known that. Autumn would have known that. "Tell me about our trip to Boston," it said, changing the subject. "Remember how much fun we had?" My blood went cold. We'd never been to Boston. Not once in our entire marriage. Autumn had always wanted to go, talked about visiting in the fall to see the leaves, but we'd never made the trip. She died still wanting to see Boston. "We never went to Boston," I said quietly. The smile faltered, just for a second. Then it came back, wider. "Of course we did. Don't you remember?" "Get out," I said, my voice shaking. "You're not my wife. Get out of my house." The thing that looked like Autumn tilted its head again, studying me with those almost right eyes. "But I am her. I came back for you. Isn't this what you wanted?" "Not like this. Not whatever you are." For a long moment, it just stood there, watching me. Then it spoke again, and this time the voice was slightly off. the pitch not quite matching Autumn's. She loved you very much. All these memories of you, so strong, so clear. It made it easy to find my way here. What are you? I whispered. It didn't answer. Instead, it started to fade, becoming translucent like smoke. But before it disappeared completely, it spoke one more time. She's not here anymore, Rocco. But I could be. I could stay. I could learn to be exactly what you need. No, I said firmly. Leave. You're not welcome here. You're not her, and I don't want you. The thing that wasn't Autumn looked almost sad for a moment. Then it faded completely, leaving me alone in the living room with my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on, trying to process what had happened. Something had been using my grief, using Autumn's memory to get close to me. It had been studying the house, learning from her belongings, trying to piece together who she was, but it had gotten details wrong, important details, and when I tested it, it had failed. The humming started again around dawn, but I ignored it. You're not Autumn, I said aloud, and you need to leave. The humming stopped. The house fell silent. Over the next few days, the activity gradually decreased. I'd still occasionally hear her voice or see something moved, but less frequently. I started packing up Autumn's things, finally ready to let them go. Not because I wanted to forget her, but because I realized that keeping her belongings around was feeding whatever that thing was, giving it more material to work with. My daughter Salem came to visit, and I told her everything. She was concerned, suggested I talk to someone, maybe a grief counselor. I agreed. But I also told her what I'd learned, that some things out there know how to exploit love and loss. They can sense grief like blood in the water, and they'll use it to get close to you, to find a way in. A month later, I moved to Charlotte to be closer to Salem and her family. I sold the house on the ridge, and I hope whoever bought it doesn't leave too much of themselves lying around, because I learned something in those mountains outside Asheville. The dead don't come back, but something else might try to wear their face. And if you love someone enough, if you want them back desperately enough, you might not notice the wrong details until it's too late. I still hear the humming sometimes, late at night when I'm alone. But now I know it's not Autumn, and I've learned to tell it to leave, because the real Autumn wouldn't want me living with an imitation, with something that was almost her, but not quite. She'd want me to remember her correctly, with all the right details, all the perfect imperfections that made her who she was. That's how I honor her now, by refusing to accept anything less than the truth of who she was, even when the lie is so much more comforting than the empty space she left behind. Sometimes the worst storms aren't the ones that knock out your power. They're the ones that reveal what's been hiding in the darkness around you. I found out the hard way that isolation in the Virginia mountains comes with dangers the weather reports never mention. My name is Brooklyn Turner, and I'm 34 years old. I'm a single mother of 2 boys, ages 7 and 9, and for the past 3 years, we'd been living in a small 2-bedroom house at the end of a dirt road outside Roanoke, Virginia. It wasn't much, but the rent was cheap, and it gave my kids room to play. The isolation never bothered me. I grew up in the country, knew how to handle being far from neighbors. Or at least, I thought I did. My ex-husband Sutton had visitation rights every other weekend. That particular October weekend, he'd asked if he could keep the boys an extra night so his mother could see them. She lived 3 hours away and didn't get to visit often. I agreed, grateful for a rare weekend to myself. It had been months since I'd had the house completely to myself. No kids, no responsibilities, just peace and quiet. Friday evening started out perfect. I ordered takeout, opened a bottle of wine, put on a movie I'd been wanting to watch. Around 7 p.m., the weather turned. The forecast had mentioned possible storms, but I hadn't paid much attention. In the mountains, storms came and went. You learn to live with them. This one was different. The wind picked up fast, bending trees nearly horizontal. Rain came down in sheets so thick I couldn't see my car in the driveway. Thunder shook the house, and lightning turned the world outside into a strobe light. Around 7:30, the power went out. I wasn't worried at first. We had a backup generator that could run the fridge and a few lights. I went out to the shed to start it up, getting soaked in the 30 seconds it took to run there and back. The generator kicked on fine, giving me enough power to keep food cold and maintain one light in each room. It would be enough to get through the night. But as I was drying off in the kitchen, I heard something that stopped me cold. Scratching. Coming from inside the walls. Not the random settling sounds old houses make. This was rhythmic, deliberate. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A pause. Then again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I stood there, dripping on the kitchen floor, listening. The scratching was coming from the wall between the kitchen and the living room. It moved as I listened, traveling along the wall toward the back of the house. I told myself it was an animal, a squirrel or raccoon that had gotten into the walls seeking shelter from the storm. It happened sometimes in old houses, but the scratching was too loud, too forceful for a small animal. And it was moving with purpose, like whatever was in there was following the layout of the house, learning it. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the bedroom, pressing my ear against the wall. The scratching had stopped. Everything was quiet except for the storm outside. I was about to convince myself I'd imagined it when I heard something else. A low, scraping sound coming from my closet. The closet door was closed. I always kept it closed, but as I stood there with my flashlight, I could hear something moving inside it. Not scratching now, but a sliding sound, like something dragging across the floor. My heart was pounding as I approached the closet. Every instinct told me not to open it, to leave it alone, to maybe just grab my keys and leave. But this was my house. If an animal had gotten in, I needed to know. I couldn't just leave it there. I pulled the door open fast, flashlight raised. Claw marks, deep, fresh gouges in the back wall of the closet, tearing through the drywall. 4 parallel lines, like fingers, scraped down from ceiling height to the floor. The marks were new. I would have noticed them before. The drywall dust was still white and fresh on the floor. I backed out of the closet, my mouth dry. Those weren't animal scratches. The spacing was wrong. The depth was wrong. They looked like human fingernails had torn through the wall, but no human could claw through drywall like that. Not without tools. Not without breaking every nail and finger. I closed the closet door and pushed my dresser in front of it, hands shaking. Then I called Sutton. It went to voicemail. I tried my friend Penelope, who lived in town. No answer. The storm had probably knocked out cell towers. I had signal, but it was weak and intermittent. That's when I looked out the back window and saw it. A face, pale and dirt-streaked, pressed against the glass, staring in at me. Human features, but wrong somehow. The proportions slightly off, the expression blank. We made eye contact for maybe 3 seconds before lightning flashed, and I saw it clearly. Mud-cake skin, matted hair, clothes that were barely clothes anymore, just tatters. And the eyes, completely aware, completely focused on me. I screamed and jumped back from the window. When I looked again, it was gone. My whole body was shaking. Someone was outside. Someone had been watching me. I ran through the house, checking every window, every door, making sure everything was locked. The storm was still raging, rain pounding on the roof. I couldn't hear anything else over it, which meant if someone was moving around outside, I wouldn't know. I tried calling 911, but my cell signal was gone now. The landline was dead. It ran on electricity, and the generator wasn't powering it. I was completely cut off. The scratching started again, but this time it was coming from the back door. Long, deliberate scrapes, like fingernails running down the wood. Then the doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to open it, testing it, seeing if it was locked. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I had and stood in the middle of the living room, trying to watch all the windows and doors at once. The doorknob rattling stopped. For a long moment, everything was quiet. Then I heard it at the window next to the door, scratching on the glass, that same deliberate scraping. I couldn't see anyone. The storm and darkness made it impossible to see more than a few feet outside, but I could hear them moving around the house. First the back door, then the window, then I heard them at the side of the house near the bathroom. They were circling the house, testing every entry point. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Every window, every door. I'd hear scratching, then the sound of something testing the frame, checking if it would open. Whoever was out there was methodical, patient, thorough. I was starting to panic, my breath coming in short gasps. I was alone with no way to call for help, and someone was actively trying to get into my house. The storm meant no one would hear me scream. The nearest neighbor was 3/4 of a mile away. Then suddenly, the scratching stopped. Everything went quiet except for the storm. I stood there in the dim generator light, gripping the knife, waiting. 5 minutes passed. 10. Nothing. I started to think maybe they'd given up, moved on, decided the house was too secure. I was just beginning to relax when I heard it. Footsteps on the roof. Heavy, deliberate footsteps walking across my roof directly above me. I looked up at the ceiling, tracking the sound. The footsteps moved from one end of the house to the other, then stopped. Right above my bedroom, where there was a skylight. I ran to the bedroom and looked up. In the flashes of lightning, I could see a dark shape on the skylight, a silhouette against the glass, hands pressed against it, testing it, pushing. The skylight wasn't designed to hold much weight. It was just a single pane of glass in a frame. I heard a crack. The glass was giving way. That's when survival instinct kicked in. I couldn't stay in the house. If that skylight broke, whatever was up there would be inside, and I'd be trapped. I had to run. I grabbed my car keys and my phone, said a prayer, and ran for the front door. I unlocked it, threw it open, and sprinted through the pouring rain toward my car. I was soaked instantly, could barely see. I got to my car, hands fumbling with the key fob, and finally got it unlocked. As I dove into the driver's seat, I looked back at the house. There was someone standing on the roof, silhouetted against the sky. Tall, thin, impossibly still, despite the wind and rain, just standing there, watching me. I started the car and peeled out of the driveway, my tires spinning in the mud. I drove straight to town, to the police station, dripping wet and hysterical. I tried to explain what happened, but I know how it sounded. A woman alone, spooked by a storm, seeing things. But they sent officers out to check anyway. When they got to my house an hour later, after the storm had passed, they found evidence I wasn't crazy. The skylight was cracked, shattered, in and places like something heavy had been on it. There were muddy footprints on the roof and around the perimeter of the house, and inside those claw marks in my closet were real and deep. What they told me next made everything worse. There had been reports in that area for years. A feral person, possibly a man, living in the woods. Avoiding contact with people mostly, but occasionally getting aggressive, especially during storms. Local authorities knew about him, but had never been able to locate where he lived in the dense forest. Apparently, some of the old-timers in the area knew about him, but never warned newcomers because they didn't want to scare people or hurt property values. The police helped me pack some things, and I stayed with Penelope in town that night, and for several nights after. When I finally went back to get more of my belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from the trees. I broke my lease and moved to an apartment complex in Roanoke within 2 weeks. Lost my security deposit and took a financial hit, but I didn't care. I couldn't live in that house knowing someone had been out there in the dark, testing my windows, walking on my roof, trying to find a way in. What haunts me most is this. If my kids had been home that night, I would never have run. I would have stayed to protect them. And I don't know if we would have survived once that skylight broke. I don't know what that person would have done, what they wanted. I only know that in rural Virginia, in the mountains, where help is far away, some dangers are known by the locals but kept secret. And those of us who move in from somewhere else only find out when it's almost too late. I still check every window, every door, multiple times before bed, and I never, ever stay anywhere truly isolated anymore. Because I learned that some people choose to live outside of society, in the woods, in the darkness, and when storms knock out the power and cut you off from help, that's when they come out. That's when they test your doors and windows. That's when they find out if you're really alone. They say some objects hold memories, but I never believed it until I found a diary that knew my future before I lived it. The worst part wasn't what it predicted. It was realizing I might never escape what it had already written. My name is Leonidas Cross, though everyone calls me Leo. I'm 23 years old, a senior at Georgia State University studying computer science. I've always been a skeptic, the kind of person who needs data and evidence before believing anything. I thought ghosts were stories people told to explain things they didn't understand. I thought the supernatural was just superstition dressed up as truth. I was wrong about all of it, and I learned that lesson in the worst possible way during what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend at my family's hunting cabin. The cabin sits in the Chattahoochee National Forest in North Georgia, about 2 hours north of Atlanta. It's been in our family for 3 generations, a place my grandfather built back in the 1970s as a retreat from city life. My father inherited it, and we'd been going there for hunting trips and weekend getaways my whole life. The place holds good memories for me. Learning to fish with my dad, late nights playing cards with my cousins, the smell of wood smoke and pine trees. It was always a safe place, a peaceful place. That October, I'd planned a weekend trip with 3 of my college friends, Mac, Fabian, and Jonathan. We were going to do some hiking, maybe hunt if we saw anything, mostly just drink beer and disconnect from our phones for a few days before midterms hit. But the Thursday before we were supposed to leave, all 3 of them bailed. Mac's girlfriend had a crisis, Fabian got called into work, and Jonathan came down with the flu. They all apologized, said we'd reschedule, but I'd already taken Friday off work, and I was stressed enough that I needed the break, so I decided to go alone. I'd been to the cabin by myself before, though not overnight. My parents thought it was fine. I was an adult, I knew the area, and I had my phone if anything went wrong. They were more worried about me getting bored than anything else. I arrived Friday afternoon, the October sun filtering through the trees in that golden way that makes everything look peaceful. The cabin was exactly as we'd left it last spring. A little dusty, but solid and welcoming. 2 bedrooms, a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bathroom with a shower that only gave lukewarm water on its best days. No TV, no internet, just books and cards, and the sounds of the forest. Perfect. I spent that evening getting settled, building a fire, making dinner. I was reading on the couch around 10 p.m. when I started hearing sounds from above me. The cabin has an attic, accessible by a pull-down ladder in the hallway. We rarely went up there. It was just storage for old hunting equipment, some furniture my grandparents had left behind, boxes of junk nobody wanted to sort through. But now I could clearly hear something moving around up there. Heavy, rhythmic banging, like someone hitting the floor with their fist. Bang, 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 pause. Then again, bang, bang, bang. My first thought was an animal. Raccoons got into attics all the time, but this didn't sound like random animal movement. It was too regular, too deliberate, and it was loud, way louder than a raccoon could make. I listened for about 10 minutes, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the banging continued with that same unsettling rhythm. Finally, I grabbed a flashlight and pulled down the attic ladder. The air that came down was cold and stale, thick with dust. I climbed up slowly, sweeping my flashlight beam across the dark space. The attic was cramped, maybe 5 feet of clearance at the center, where the roof peaked. I could see the old furniture, the stacked boxes, a rack of ancient hunting rifles my grandfather had left behind. Everything looked normal, undisturbed. But something caught my eye. A leather-bound book lying on the floor in the center of the attic, right where the banging had seemed to come from. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. I walked over, crouching under the low ceiling, and picked it up. It was a diary, old and worn, the leather cracked with age. The pages were yellowed and brittle. I opened it to the first entry and felt my skin prickle. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. October 12th, 1963. If you're reading this, leave immediately. Don't stay after dark. Don't read beyond this page. The cabin holds something, and once it knows you're here, it won't let you go. I'm trapped. I keep trying to leave, but I can't. The same day keeps repeating. I've lived October 12th 17 times now. Please, whoever you are, don't make the same mistake I did. Leave. I stood there in the dusty attic, reading those words by flashlight. Part of me wanted to laugh. It read like a bad horror movie. But the handwriting was genuinely distressed, the paper genuinely old, and that warning felt uncomfortably specific for a prank. I flipped through a few more pages. Each entry was dated October 12th, 1963, but they were numbered. Day 1, Day 5, Day 11. The writer described the same day happening over and over, with small variations in their attempts to escape. They'd try to leave in their car, but it wouldn't start. They'd try hiking out, but they'd end up back at the cabin. They'd try to stay awake all night, but they'd black out and wake up to the same morning. The entries became more desperate, more unhinged. The last entry, labeled Day 23, just said, "I understand now. It feeds on the repetition. Every loop makes it stronger. If you're reading this, you're already caught. I'm sorry." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I should have stopped reading right there, but I kept flipping through. The pages after that entry were blank for a while. Then new handwriting appeared. Smaller, neater, but equally desperate. A different person dated. March 15th, 1978. Same story, same trap, same realization. More blank pages, then another set of entries from 1989, then 1997, then 2006. The diary was a collection of people who'd gotten trapped in this cabin, living the same day over and over until what? The entries always stopped after a few weeks. What happened to these people? I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't notice the time passing. When I finally looked at my phone, it was 11:47 p.m. I'd been in the attic for almost 2 hours. I should go to bed, I thought. Deal with this weirdness in the morning. Maybe it was just an elaborate prank someone had set up, though that seemed unlikely given how old the diary was. I climbed back down, secured the attic ladder, and went to the bedroom. I was exhausted suddenly, overwhelmingly tired. I barely managed to brush my teeth before collapsing into bed. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the window. I checked my phone. 7:30 a.m. I felt groggy, like I'd slept hard but not well. I got up, made coffee, and tried to shake off the weird feeling from the night before. I decided I'd hike down to where I'd parked my car and maybe drive into town, get some fresh air, clear my head. But when I went outside, my car wouldn't start. The engine turned over, but wouldn't catch. I tried several times. Nothing. The battery was fine, the starter was working, but it just wouldn't start. Frustration bubbled up. Of course this would happen. I was 2 hours from anywhere, alone, with no cell signal at the cabin. I went back inside to figure out my options. That's when I noticed the clock on the wall. It said 9 p.m. But it had been morning just a minute ago. My phone now read 9 p.m. October 16th. I stood there staring at it, confused. Had I lost the entire day? Had I blacked out? That didn't make sense. I felt fine, alert, awake. Then I heard it again. The banging from the attic. Bang, bang, bang. My blood ran cold. I climbed back up to the attic, and the diary was lying in the exact same spot, open to a different page. A page that had been blank before. Now it had new writing, in handwriting I didn't recognize, but that looked disturbingly neat and practiced. October 16th, 2025, Day 1. My name is Leonidas Cross. I found this diary last night and I should have listened. I woke up this morning and tried to leave, but my car won't start. Then I lost time. It's night now and I don't remember the day. I think it's starting. I think I'm trapped. I hadn't written that. I know I hadn't written that. But it was there, in ink that looked fresh, describing exactly what had just happened to me. My hands started shaking. I flipped to the next page. More writing appeared before my eyes, words forming on the blank page like invisible ink being revealed. October 16th, 2025, Day 2. I tried to hike out today but ended up back at the cabin. Tried again. Same result. The forest loops. There's no escape. Every path leads back here. But I hadn't done that yet. I hadn't tried to hike out. The diary was predicting what I was going to do. Or maybe it was writing what had already happened in loops I hadn't lived yet. Panic set in. I needed to get out. I needed to leave right now, before whatever this was could trap me further. I ran downstairs, grabbed my jacket and keys, and headed for the door. As I reached for the doorknob, I felt a wave of exhaustion hit me like a physical force. My vision blurred. My legs gave out. When I came to, I was lying on the couch. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows. My phone read 7:30 a.m. October 16th, the same morning as before. I sat up, my heart hammering. No, this couldn't be happening. I'd just been trying to leave. It had been night. Now it was morning again. The day had reset. I ran outside. My car was there, exactly where I'd parked it. I tried to start it. Engine turned over, but wouldn't catch. Same as before. I screamed in frustration and tried again. Nothing. I checked my phone. Still no signal. I started walking, heading for the road that led out of the forest. I walked for what felt like hours, but eventually I recognized a tree with a distinctive split trunk. Then another familiar landmark. The cabin appeared ahead of me. I'd walked in a complete circle without realizing it. The forest had led me back. I tried again, choosing a different direction, marking trees as I went. Same result. No matter which way I walked, I ended up back at the cabin. By the time I returned the third time, it was getting dark. I checked the clock, 9:20 p.m. My phone agreed. I'd lost the entire middle of the day again, compressed into what felt like minutes. The banging started from the attic. I climbed up, already knowing what I'd find. The diary. Open, with new entries. Day 2. Tried to hike out. Forest loops back. Can't escape. Day 3. Tried to stay awake through the transition. Failed. Woke up at 7:30 a.m. again. Day 4. Tried to destroy the cabin. Axe broke. Fire wouldn't start. Cabin repairs itself. Day 5. Tried to destroy the diary. Can't burn it. Can't tear it. Threw it in the woods. Woke up. It was back in the attic. Each entry documented attempts I hadn't made yet, or maybe had made in loops I didn't remember. The diary was showing me my future failures, or recording a present I kept forgetting. I couldn't tell anymore. I sat in that attic, reading entry after entry, watching my own handwriting appear on blank pages, documenting days I hadn't lived yet. Day 8, Day 11, Day 15. Each one more desperate. Each one describing failed escape attempts, growing madness, the realization that I was truly trapped. But then I found something the previous trapped people hadn't written. In the margin of Day 7, in my own handwriting, but hurried, almost illegible. The diary is the anchor. It records the loops. Can't destroy it, but maybe can change what it's anchored to. Fireplace. Burn it in the old fireplace with the iron grate. Must be at exactly midnight. Break the cycle. I looked at my phone. 9:47 p.m. I had 2 hours. I grabbed the diary and climbed down from the attic. My future self had left me instructions. Whether I'd already tried this in a loop I didn't remember, or whether I was seeing it for the first time, I didn't know. But it was the only lead I had. I built a fire in the old stone fireplace, the one my grandfather had built with the ornate iron grate forged by some local blacksmith in the 1970s. I fed it wood, got it burning hot. The diary sat on the mantel, and I swear I could feel it watching me, aware of what I was planning. As midnight approached, strange things started happening. The lights flickered. The banging in the attic became frantic, constant. The temperature dropped until I could see my breath. Something didn't want me to do this. At 11:58 p.m., I picked up the diary. It felt heavier than before, like it was resisting. At 11:59, I held it over the flames. The pages started to flutter, even though there was no wind, and I heard voices, all the people who'd been trapped, their whispers overlapping, begging, warning, crying. At exactly midnight, I dropped it into the fire. The diary didn't burn like paper should. It writhed in the flames like something alive, the leather twisting, the pages curling in ways that defied physics. The voices became screams. The whole cabin shook. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, something shattered. Everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in my car on the road outside the forest, slumped over the steering wheel. Sunlight streamed through the windshield. My phone read 8:15 a.m., October 17th, not October 16th, the next day. I'd lost an entire night, but I'd also gained a day. The loop had broken. I started my car. It turned over perfectly, and drove straight home to Atlanta. I didn't stop, didn't look back. When I got home, my roommate said I'd been gone for 3 days, not 2. I had no memory of the third day. I never went back to that cabin. My parents eventually sold it to a developer who tore it down. I hope that ended whatever was there. I hope I was the last person to get trapped in that loop. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that banging. Bang, bang, bang. And I wonder if I really escaped, or if this is just another loop I haven't figured out yet. The diary is gone, but the feeling of being watched, of living in repeating time, never quite left me. I learned something in that cabin in North Georgia. Time isn't as linear as we think. Some places can trap you in moments, force you to live them over and over. And sometimes, the only way out is to trust a message from a version of yourself you don't remember being. I saved myself from a future I'd already lived, and I'll never fully understand how that's possible. I just know I'm grateful I listened to my own warning, written in a diary that should never have existed. There are sounds in the Appalachian Mountains that have been luring people to their deaths for longer than anyone can remember. I found out too late that some of those sounds know exactly how to break your heart before they break everything else. My name is Ivory Patterson, and I'm 51 years old. I've lived in the Kentucky hollers my whole life, raised 3 kids in a small house, surrounded by steep wooded hills outside Prestonsburg. I know these mountains. I know which paths are safe and which ones disappear into old mine shafts. I know the sounds of the forest at night, owls, coyotes, the wind through the pines. I thought I knew everything these hills could throw at me. But some things in the mountains are older than knowledge, older than memory, and they know us better than we know ourselves. My husband Moises is a hunting guide. Every October, he takes groups of out-of-state hunters on week-long trips through Montana and Wyoming. It's good money, and I've never minded the time alone. We've been married for 28 years, and I'm comfortable with solitude. Our kids are grown, 2 daughters living in Lexington and a son in the Army stationed overseas. The house gets quiet when Moises is gone, but I like the peace. I read, I work on my quilts, I enjoy not having to cook for anyone but myself. That particular October trip, Moises left on a Sunday. He'd be gone for 9 days, guiding a group of lawyers from Chicago through elk country. He kissed me goodbye, told me to call if I needed anything, and drove off in his pickup. I settled into my routine. Coffee on the porch at sunrise, working in the garden, evening walks around the property before dark. Our house sits in a holler, which is what we call the valleys between the hills here. Steep ridges rise on 3 sides, thick with oak and pine. There's a creek that runs behind the property, and an old logging road that winds up into the hills. The nearest neighbor is about half a mile away, the Leandro family. Good people who've lived here as long as we have. It's isolated, but That's how we like it. The first night Moises was gone, everything was normal. I read until about 10, then went to bed. The second night, that's when it started. I woke around 3 in the morning to the sound of a child crying. Not an infant. This was an older child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, sobbing like their heart was broken. The sound was coming from outside, somewhere near the back of the property by the tree line. I sat up in bed, my heart immediately tight with concern. A child, out here, at 3 in the morning. That didn't make sense. There were no children living nearby. The Leandro kids were grown. There was no one else within miles. But I could hear it clearly through the closed window, desperate, heartbroken crying. I got out of bed and went to the window. The motion light on the back porch had come on, casting a pale glow across the yard. I could see maybe 30 feet before the darkness of the woods began. Nothing moved out there. But the crying continued, floating through the night air, impossible to ignore. Every maternal instinct I had was screaming at me to go help. A child was out there, alone, crying. But something else, some deep, ancient part of my brain, was telling me to stay inside. Stay away from the windows. Don't respond. I stood there frozen between those two impulses, my hand on the window frame, listening. The crying moved. Not walking movement. It just relocated, suddenly coming from a different direction, closer to the house. Now it sounded like it was coming from the side yard near the garden. Still that same heartbroken sobbing, a child in distress. I went to the side window. The crying moved again, now from the front of the house, leading me, following me through the house. Whatever was making that sound was tracking me room to room. That's when the fear really set in. This wasn't a lost child. Children don't move like that. Silent between cries, repositioning faster than walking speed. Children don't follow someone through a house from outside, matching them window to window. I backed away from the windows and stood in the center of the living room, my heart pounding. The crying continued for another 10 minutes, circling the house, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Complete silence, just the normal night sounds of the holler, wind, the creek, distant owls. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat on the couch with every light on, my phone in my hand, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. Maybe it was a fox. They can make sounds like crying sometimes. Maybe it was a bobcat. Mountain lions scream like women. Maybe it was some animal I didn't recognize. But I knew the sounds animals make. I'd lived here my whole life, and I'd never heard an animal that sounded exactly like a human child crying. The next morning in daylight, I forced myself to go outside and look around. I walked the perimeter of the house, examining the ground near where I'd heard the crying. In the soft mud near the back porch, I found footprints. Small, bare feet, child-sized. But they didn't lead anywhere. The prints appeared in 3 separate spots. Under the kitchen window, near the garden, by the front steps. But there were no prints between them. No trail showing how the child had moved from place to place. Just isolated prints, like something had been placed in those spots but hadn't actually walked there. I took photos on my phone and called Moises. He was 3 hours ahead in Montana, already out with his hunting group, but he called me back during their lunch break. I told him what happened, trying not to sound hysterical, trying to present it as a strange occurrence rather than genuine fear. "Probably just a fox or something," he said, echoing my own desperate explanation from the night before. "You know how weird they sound sometimes." The footprints, though, could be from the Leandro kids. They cut through our property sometimes, you know that. But the Leandro kids were 18 and 20, not children, and they wouldn't be walking barefoot through the woods at 3 in the morning. I didn't argue with him, though. I could hear the concern in his voice, and I knew if I pushed it, he'd try to come home early. We needed the money from this trip. "I'm fine," I told him. "Just spooked myself. I'll call the Leandros, see if they've seen anything weird." I did call them. Carmen Leandro said they hadn't heard anything unusual, but she'd keep an ear out. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that her grandmother used to tell stories about sounds in these hills. Crying that wasn't real crying. Things that mimicked voices to lure people into the woods. Old mountain stories, she said, laughing a little. You know how those old folks were. But Granny always said if you hear something crying in the night, you don't go out. You don't investigate. You let it cry itself out and you stay inside. I thanked her and hung up, feeling cold despite the warm October sun. That night, I was ready. I locked every door and window. I kept my phone charged, and next to me, I went to bed at my normal time but didn't really expect to sleep. The crying started again at 1:30 a.m., earlier than before. Same heartbroken sobbing, same child's voice. But this time, it was accompanied by words I could almost make out. Help me. Please. I'm scared. My heart broke and raced at the same time. Every instinct screamed at me to go help, to save this child. But I remembered Carmen's grandmother's warning. I remembered those impossible footprints. I stayed in bed, covers pulled up, hands over my ears, tears streaming down my face because it sounded so real, so desperate, so much like a genuine child in trouble. The crying got closer. I could hear it right outside my bedroom window now, which faced the woods. Please, help me. I can't find my way home. It's so dark. I looked at the window despite myself. In the moonlight, I could see a shadow on the glass. Small, child-shaped, hands pressed against the window like they were trying to see in. But the hands were wrong. Too long, fingers too thin. Let me in, the child's voice said, sweet and pleading. I'm so cold, please let me in. I buried my face in my pillow, forcing myself not to respond, not to look, not to engage. The crying continued for what felt like hours. Sometimes it was at the window. Sometimes at the door. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. Always that same desperate pleading. Always words calculated to break my heart and make me open a door. Around 4 a.m., the voice changed tactics. Mama, it called. Mama, why won't you help me? It was using my daughter's voice, Holly, my youngest, calling for me. I knew it was a trick. Holly was 26 years old, living in Lexington, probably asleep in her apartment, but hearing. Her voice, her childhood voice crying for me was almost more than I could bear. I grabbed my phone and called Holly right then, needing to hear her adult voice, needing proof that she was okay. She answered, groggy and confused. Mom, it's 4 a.m. Are you okay? The sound of her adult voice, safe and annoyed and real, gave me the strength to keep resisting. I'm fine, baby. I'm sorry. Just had a nightmare. Needed to hear your voice. You're sure you're okay? You sound weird. Outside, the voice that wasn't Holly continued to cry. Mama, please, I'm scared. I'm fine. Go back to sleep. I love you. I hung up and turned on every light in the house. I sat in the living room with a kitchen knife in my lap. Not because I thought it would help against whatever was out there, but because it made me feel slightly less helpless. The crying continued until dawn, when it finally faded with the arrival of daylight. The next morning I found more footprints, but these were everywhere, around the entire house, in circles, overlapping patterns. Small bare feet had walked around my home for hours, and in the garden I found something that made my blood run cold, a small handprint in the dirt pressed deep. But it had 6 fingers. I called Carmen again. This time I told her everything. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, You need to come stay with us. Tonight. Don't be there alone. What is it? I asked. What am I dealing with? My grandmother called it the hollering child. Said it's been in these hills for generations. Nobody knows what it is. Some kind of spirit, or something else. It mimics children's voices, cries for help, uses everything it can to make you come outside. Once you're out in the woods, following it, she trailed off. What happens? They find people at the bottom of old mine shafts, ivory, or in the creek, drowned, or they don't find them at all. It leads people away from safety, gets them turned around in the dark, takes them to dangerous places. My grandmother said it feeds on something. Sympathy, maybe. Or just the fear. She wasn't sure. But she said it's been doing it since before her grandmother's time. I should have left right then. Should have packed a bag and driven to the Leandros' house or into town. But it was daytime. And in the daylight, it was easier to feel brave, to convince myself I was overreacting. That night, the fourth night, it got worse. The crying started at midnight, but now it was multiple voices. Children, plural, all crying at once. They surrounded the house, calling from every direction. "Help us. We're lost. Please, we're so scared." Then I heard Moises's voice. "Ivory, let me in. I forgot my key. Ivory, open the door." But Moises was in Montana. I talked to him that afternoon. This thing had learned his voice somehow, maybe from hearing us talk on the phone, or maybe it could just reach into my memory and pull out the voices I loved most. "I know you're not him," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "You're not my husband. You're not children. I don't know what you are, but you can't come in. You're not welcome here." The voices stopped. Complete silence for maybe 30 seconds. Then the crying started again, but different this time. Angry crying, frustrated. The sounds of something that had been denied what it wanted. Things started hitting the house. Rocks, I thought at first, thrown against the walls and windows. But the impacts were too heavy, too forceful. Something was hitting my house hard enough to shake the walls. I huddled in the bathroom, the only room without windows, listening to the assault. It went on for over an hour before finally stopping. When dawn came, I didn't even check the damage. I threw clothes in a bag, got in my car, and drove straight to the Leandros. Carmen took one look at my face and pulled me inside. I stayed there for the next 5 days until Moises came home. When he got back, we walked the property together in daylight. The house had dents in the siding where something had struck it repeatedly. Handprints, too many to count, covered every window, some with the wrong number of fingers. And in the woods behind the house, about 50 yards in, we found an old mine shaft I'd never known was there. It was hidden by brush, no warning signs, no barriers. Just a black hole in the ground dropping into nothing. The crying had been leading me toward it, trying to get me out of the house and into the dark where I would have been turned around, disoriented, walking blind. I would have fallen right into that shaft, and nobody would have found me for days, maybe weeks. We moved 6 months later. Couldn't take the offer we wanted, sold the house at a loss. The family who bought it, people from out of state who were charmed by the remote location. We tried to warn them. Told them about the sounds, the crying. They smiled politely and probably thought we were crazy mountain folk trying to spook them. I hope they listen when they hear the crying. I hope they remember what we said and stay inside. But I doubt they will, because that sound is designed to break your heart. It's designed to override every bit of common sense and reason. It knows exactly what voice to use, exactly what words to say. It's been practicing on people in these mountains for longer than anyone can remember. I still hear it sometimes, even though we live in town now. Late at night, when everything's quiet, I'll hear a child crying and my whole body goes cold. But it's just regular sounds now, wind or cats or actual children playing in the distance. Nothing following me, nothing mimicking, nothing leading me toward darkness. But I learned something in that holler in Kentucky. Some things in the mountains are older than we are, smarter than we are, and hungry for something we have. And they'll use every weapon at their disposal, our compassion, our love, our instinct to help, to get what they want. The thing that saved me wasn't being brave. It was being terrified enough to stay inside, to resist every instinct screaming at me to help. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ignore a cry for help, because in these mountains, not everything that cries is something you want to find. I thought technology was something I understood, predictable, logical, something you could control with the right knowledge. Then I spent a weekend in my grandparents' house, and discovered that old machines can record things that were never meant to be captured, including conversations I had no memory of having. My name is Ian Bennett, and I'm 16 years old. I'm what people call a tech-savvy kid. I build computers. I code. I understand how things work on a fundamental level. I've always believed that if something seems supernatural, it's just technology or science we don't understand yet. That confidence, that certainty in the rational world was completely shattered during 2 nights alone in my grandparents' house in Tennessee. What I experienced there taught me that some old technology can bridge gaps that should never be bridged, recording conversations between the living and things that shouldn't exist. My grandparents, Emmanuel and Raylan, are good people who've been married for 50 years. They live in a comfortable 2-story house outside Cookeville, Tennessee, a place they bought in the early 1980s and have maintained meticulously ever since. I've been visiting that house my whole life. Holidays, summer vacations, random weekends. It's always felt safe, familiar, filled with the smell of my grandmother's cooking and the sound of my grandfather's old jazz records. In mid-October, they took a cruise to celebrate their anniversary. 14 days sailing around the Caribbean, something they'd been planning for over a year. My parents were supposed to house sit, but at the last minute my dad had to travel for work, and my mom needed to go with him. They asked if I was mature enough to stay at the house alone, keep an eye on things, water the plants, bring in the mail. I jumped at the chance. 2 weeks alone with fast internet and my grandparents' huge TV. It sounded perfect. My parents dropped me off on a Friday afternoon with enough groceries to last the weekend. They'd be back Sunday to check on me. Then I'd be on my own for the rest of the time. I spent that first evening settling in, gaming online with friends, eating pizza, enjoying the freedom of having an entire house to myself. The weirdness started around 10 p.m. I was in the living room when the TV changed channels on its own. I was in the middle of a show, controller in my hand, when suddenly the screen switched to static. Not just blank screen, actual analog static. That old school snow and hiss that modern TVs don't even display anymore. I grabbed the remote to change it back, but it wouldn't respond. The batteries were dead, apparently, though they'd been working fine 5 minutes earlier. I got up to change the channel manually, and the TV switched back to my show on its own. I stood there staring at it, trying to figure out the logic. Maybe a short in the remote sensor, some kind of interference from my phone. I'm good with electronics. I could troubleshoot this. But before I could investigate further, I heard something else. Whispering. Multiple voices, faint, coming from the air vents. The house has an old forced air heating system and sound travels through those vents in weird ways. I've heard my grandparents' voices carry from upstairs to the basement before, but these weren't their voices, and there shouldn't have been anyone else in the house. I went to the nearest vent and listened. The whispers were clearer here, but I still couldn't make out words. It sounded like several people having urgent, overlapping conversations. Then I heard my own voice, unmistakably me, saying something I couldn't quite catch. My skin prickled. I checked my phone. No pocket dial, no apps running that might have picked up my voice. The whispering continued for another minute or so, then faded away. I convinced myself it was some kind of acoustic phenomenon. Sound bouncing weirdly through old ductwork, maybe picking up radio interference, my voice echoing back from when I'd been talking to my friends online earlier. It made sense if I didn't think about it too hard. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The house felt different in the dark, less familiar. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to see shadows moving in the hallway outside my room. Not vague shapes, distinct shadows of people walking past, cast on the wall by some light source I couldn't identify. I could see them clearly. Tall, thin figures, at least 3 of them, moving silently from one end of the hallway to the other. I got out of bed, my heart pounding, and looked into the hallway. Nothing there. All the lights were off. But I'd seen those shadows, clear as anything. I checked every room on the 2nd floor, all empty. I went downstairs, turned on every light, searched the whole house. I was completely alone. By the time the sun came up, I'd convinced myself I'd been dreaming or experiencing some kind of sleep paralysis hallucination. My parents video called me Sunday afternoon, and I didn't tell them about any of it. I didn't want them to think I couldn't handle staying alone. I was 16, not a little kid scared of shadows. Sunday night was when everything escalated. I was in my grandfather's study. He'd told me I could use his desktop computer if I wanted, said it had better specs than my laptop. I was working on some code when I heard a sound from the hallway, a mechanical clicking and whirring, like old machinery starting up. Or I went to investigate and found the source in a storage closet. My grandfather had old audio equipment stored there, a reel-to-reel tape recorder from the 1970s, the kind that uses large spools of magnetic tape. I'd seen it before but never paid much attention. Now it was running, the spools slowly turning, even though I knew for certain it hadn't been on before. The machine was plugged in, but the power switch was in the off position. Yet it was recording, the VU meters bouncing, showing that it was picking up sound. I reached out to turn it off, then hesitated. If it was recording, that meant there was something on the tape. Maybe this was the source of the weird sounds I'd been hearing. Maybe it had been malfunctioning, recording random audio and playing it back through the house's electrical system or something. I let it run for another minute, then stopped it and rewound the tape. I hit play. What came out of that speaker made my blood turn to ice. It was my voice, clear, unmistakable, recorded recently based on the quality. But I was having a conversation I didn't remember having. "Don't understand," my voice said on the recording. "Who are you?" A pause, filled with that tape hiss. Then another voice responded. It sounded hollow, distant, but distinctly present. "We've been here a long time, since before you, since before your grandparents." "That's impossible," my recorded voice said. "This is just a house." "No," the other voice replied. "It's a threshold. The equipment allows us to speak. Without it, we're just shadows, just whispers." My hands were shaking as I held the recorder. I had no memory of this conversation. None. But that was definitely me talking, asking questions, responding. The recording continued. "What do you want?" my voice asked. "To be heard, to be remembered." The machine records us, holds us here. Every night it runs, capturing what we say. Listen to all of it. You'll understand. Then static, and the recording ended. I stared at that machine, my mind racing through explanations. AI voice synthesis, someone hacking the system, playing a prank. But the tape was physical, magnetic, old technology that couldn't be hacked remotely. And that was my voice, with inflections and patterns that would be nearly impossible to fake perfectly. I checked the tape spool. There was more recorded on it. Hours more. I fast-forwarded and played random sections. My voice, having different conversations. Sometimes asking questions. Sometimes just talking about my day, my thoughts, things I remembered thinking but never speaking aloud. And always, those other voices responding. Sometimes one, sometimes many. They talked about the house, about being trapped in the spaces between moments, about needing the recorder to exist in any meaningful way. One section made me stop cold. It was from earlier that night. I could hear the timestamp in my rambling about my code project. I was describing a bug I was trying to fix, talking in detail about my solution. I remembered thinking about all of that while working, but I hadn't spoken any of it aloud. I'd been alone, working in silence. Yet here it was, recorded. My thoughts, somehow captured and preserved on magnetic tape. "The equipment records everything," one of the other voices said on the tape. "Thoughts, words, the spaces between. It's very old technology, from a time when machines weren't properly understood. They made it too well, made it capture too much." I ejected the tape and held it in my hands. This spool of tape contained hours of conversations I didn't remember, thoughts that had never been spoken, dialogues with entities that shouldn't exist. Part of me wanted to destroy it, burn it, make it all go away. But another part, the part of me that loved puzzles and understanding how things worked, needed to know more. I spent the next hour going through the equipment in that closet. The reel-to-reel wasn't the only device. There were old voice recorders, ancient answering machines, even some early digital recording equipment from the 1990s. All of it plugged in. All of it warm to the touch, like they'd been running constantly, despite showing no outward signs of operation. I found more tapes, dated going back to 1979, the year after my grandparents bought the house. I played one at random from 1983, my grandmother's voice, young, having a conversation with someone. The other voice wasn't my grandfather. It was the same hollow, distant voice from my recording. "Just want to understand," my grandmother said on the old tape. "Are you the previous owner? Did you die here?" "We've never been alive," the voice responded. "We're echoes, patterns. The machines give us form. Your husband installed so much equipment, created such a strong field. We can almost be real here." My grandfather had been an audio engineer. That's how he'd made his living before retiring. He'd always had the latest recording equipment, loved tinkering with sound. I'd thought it was just a hobby, just professional interest. But what if he'd known? What if he'd discovered what these machines could do and had been, what? Communicating with them? Studying them? I found a journal in the closet, hidden behind the equipment. My grandfather's handwriting, technical notes mixed with observations. He documented it all. The discovery that old recording equipment, especially analog tape systems, could capture things beyond normal sound. Thoughts, presences. He'd called them residual consciousness patterns. Things that existed in the electromagnetic spectrum, given temporary form and voice through the recording process. He'd been studying them for over 40 years, talking to them, recording them, trying to understand what they were. The journal entries were careful, scientific, but there was an undercurrent of obsession. He wanted to prove they existed. He wanted to capture evidence of something beyond normal reality. The last entry, dated just a month before their cruise, said, "They're getting stronger, more coherent. The equipment network has been running long enough that they've developed persistence. I worry about turning it off. Would that be killing them? They've become almost like friends after all these years. But I also worry about what happens if they become too strong. What if they can exist without the machines?" I sat on the floor of that closet, surrounded by humming equipment, holding evidence of impossible conversations, and realized my grandfather had created something he couldn't control. He'd built a network of recording devices that had accidentally, or maybe intentionally, created a space where things that shouldn't exist, could speak, could interact. And I was alone in a house with that network still running. That's when I heard my name, not from the recorder, but from downstairs. My own voice, calling from the living room. "Ayan, are you up there?" I hadn't said that. I was upstairs, but I heard myself clearly. My voice coming from below, calling to myself. I grabbed my phone and called my parents, hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. I told them everything. The recordings, the voices, the equipment, my grandfather's journal. My dad went quiet, then said they were leaving immediately, would be there in 3 hours. I locked myself in the bathroom with my phone and a charger, and I waited. Downstairs, I could hear movement. My own voice, calling out, asking questions, talking to the entities that my grandfather's equipment had been sustaining for decades. They were using my voice, patterns they'd recorded, to exist more fully. When my parents arrived, the house was silent. All the equipment had been unplugged. I'd thrown the breakers from the bathroom before I came out, cutting power to everything. They found me sitting on the front porch, refusing to go back inside. My dad went into the house and came out carrying my grandfather's journal and several tapes. He didn't say much, but I could see the recognition in his eyes. He'd known, or at least suspected, what his father had been doing. My grandparents came back from their cruise a week later, and we had a family meeting. My grandfather confessed everything, how he'd discovered the phenomenon by accident in the early 1980s, how he'd spent decades studying it, how he'd never meant for it to become what it had. He agreed to dismantle the equipment, to clear out the house of all the old recording devices. But here's what haunts me. We took dozens of tapes from that house, recordings spanning 40 years. And sometimes, when I'm alone, my phone's voice recorder app turns itself on. I'll find audio files I didn't create, containing conversations in my voice that I don't remember having. Whatever my grandfather captured on those tapes, whatever patterns or entities he gave form to through decades of recording. I don't think they're gone. I think they found a new medium. Modern technology, digital instead of analog, cloud storage instead of magnetic tape. They've adapted, evolved, learned to exist in new systems. I'm still a tech person. I still love computers and code and understanding how things work. But I learned something in my grandparents' house in Tennessee. Sometimes our technology can open doors we never intended to open. And sometimes what comes through those doors learns how to stay, how to persist, how to use our own voices to speak back to us. I still hear myself sometimes, having conversations I don't remember. And I have to wonder, are those recordings of me? Or are they something else, using patterns captured in electromagnetic media, wearing my voice like a mask, existing in the spaces between our increasingly connected machines? I don't know, but I've stopped using voice assistants, and I manually review my phone's recording permissions every single day. Because in the age of always listening devices and constant recording, what happened in my grandfather's house could be happening everywhere. And we'd never know until we heard ourselves talking back, asking questions we never asked, saying things we never said, living in the recordings that we thought were just capturing our lives, but might actually be creating something else entirely. Music has a way of reaching through time, connecting us to moments and people long gone. But when I heard piano music coming from a room that shouldn't exist, I learned that some melodies are meant to be forgotten, and some musicians never stop playing, even after death. My name is Willa Price, and I'm 31 years old. I work as a graphic designer, freelancing from home, which means I can live pretty much anywhere with decent internet. When my boyfriend Lawrence got deployed overseas with the Army for 6 months, I decided to try something different. A friend knew about a recently renovated cabin outside Elkins, West Virginia, near the Monongahela National Forest, available for a great price. The owner wanted someone to stay there, make sure everything worked properly after the renovation, break the place in before they listed it as a vacation rental. It seemed perfect. Beautiful location, affordable rent, and I could work remotely while Lawrence was gone. The cabin was gorgeous. Someone had done an amazing job with the renovation, keeping the rustic charm while adding modern amenities. Exposed beams, a beautiful stone fireplace, updated kitchen and bathroom, huge windows looking out at the forest. The only odd thing was how the layout felt slightly off. There were spaces that seemed larger from outside than inside, but I chalked that up to the way the renovation had reconfigured things. Old cabins get modified over time, walls moved, rooms repurposed. I moved in on a Wednesday in mid-October, excited for this new adventure. Lawrence video called me that first evening from his base, and I gave him a tour, showing him the gorgeous woodwork and the views. He seemed happy that I'd found such a nice place, somewhere safe and comfortable to wait out his deployment. The first week was perfect. I worked during the days, took long walks in the forest, cooked elaborate meals just for myself, read by the fireplace in the evenings. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. Lawrence and I talked every day when the time zones aligned, and I felt connected despite the distance. The piano music started on my 9th night there. I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of someone playing classical music. It was beautiful, intricate, emotional, the kind of playing that comes from years of practice. The music was coming from somewhere in the cabin, clear enough that it sounded like it was in the next room. But I didn't own a piano. There was no piano in the cabin. I'd been through every room, every closet. I would have noticed a piano. I got out of bed and followed the sound. It seemed to be coming from the wall between the bedroom and the living room. I pressed my ear against the wall and could hear it clearly. Someone playing what sounded like a piece from the 1940s. Something romantic and melancholic. The music continued for maybe 5 more minutes, then stopped abruptly mid-phrase, like the player had been interrupted. I stood there in the darkness, my heart pounding, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. Maybe sound was carrying from a neighbor's house, but the nearest cabin was over a mile away. Maybe it was coming through the internet somehow, a speaker or device I didn't know about. I checked. Nothing was on, no devices playing music. The next morning in daylight, I examined that wall carefully. Something about it seemed wrong. I'm not an architect, but I understand space and proportion from my design work. The wall seemed too thick. I measured the bedroom, then went outside and measured the exterior. There were about 8 feet unaccounted for, space that existed in the structure but not in any room I could access. That evening, I heard the music again. Same time, around 2 a.m., same style of playing. This time I recorded it on my phone. When I played it back in the morning, the music was there, faint but audible. Proof that I wasn't imagining it. I called the property owner, a woman named Elisa, and asked about the history of the cabin. She was vague, said it had been built in the 1940s, had changed hands several times, and she'd bought it in foreclosure and renovated it. When I asked about the wall thickness and the missing space, she got quiet. "Did you find the door?" she finally asked. "What door?" She hesitated. "There's a room that was sealed up. Previous owners closed it off decades ago. I left it that way during the renovation because, well, the contractor said it would be cheaper to just build around it than to open it up and deal with whatever was in there. Is it causing problems? I hear music at night, piano music, coming from inside that space." Long silence. Then, "I didn't want to scare you off. People hear things there. That's why the rent was so low. But it's just old house sounds, the building settling. Nothing has ever actually hurt anyone." I should have left right then, but I'm stubborn, and I'd signed a 6-month lease, and the rational part of my brain still insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe there was old equipment in that sealed room that was somehow playing recordings. Maybe there were acoustic anomalies making outside sounds seem like they were inside. That night, I searched more carefully. In the back of the bedroom closet, behind where I'd hung my clothes, I found it. A seam in the wall, barely visible, where a door had been drywalled over and painted. The renovation had tried to hide it, but once I knew what to look for, I could see it clearly. I should have left it alone. Every horror movie, every scary story teaches you not to open the sealed room, but I needed to know. I needed to understand. The next morning, I used a utility knife to cut through the drywall. It was easier than I expected. The wall was thin here, just drywall over the old door. Behind it was an old wooden door with a simple handle. I turned it, and it opened. The room beyond was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, and it looked like it had been sealed up in the late 1940s and never touched since. There was an upright piano against one wall, covered in decades of dust. Sheet music sat on the music stand, yellowed and brittle. On top of the piano was a silver hairbrush and a framed photograph. The air smelled stale, preserved, like opening a time capsule. I stepped inside carefully, my phone flashlight illuminating everything. The photograph showed a woman in 1940s dress, maybe 30 years old, beautiful, sitting at what I recognized as this very piano. She had dark hair, styled in the fashion of that era, a slight smile on her face, her hands positioned on the keys like she'd been caught mid-song. The sheet music was for a song I didn't recognize, handwritten notes in the margins. One note said, "Catherine's favorite," and another said, play this for her. The date on the sheet music was April 1947. I pulled out my phone and Googled the address of the cabin plus Catherine and 1947. It took some digging, but I found it. A newspaper article from May 1947. Catherine Mills had disappeared from this property. She'd lived here with her husband, Robert. One day, she was here. The next day, she was gone. No body was ever found. Robert claimed she'd left him, run off with another man, but neighbors suspected foul play. Nothing was ever proven. Robert died in 1963, and the property changed hands several times after that. Each new owner had reported strange sounds. Music playing, a woman humming. The room had been sealed up by owners in the 1970s trying to stop the activity, but sealing it hadn't made it stop. It had just hidden the source. I stood in that small preserved room looking at Catherine's photograph, her piano, her brush, and realized I was probably standing in her tomb. Robert had killed her. I was certain of it now. Hidden her body somewhere in this room or beneath it, sealed it up, and let everyone think she'd abandoned him. And Catherine, or whatever remained of Catherine, had been trying to be heard ever since. That night, the music played again. But now that I knew whose fingers had once played this piano, it felt different. Not frightening, but sad. Deeply, achingly sad. The same pieces over and over. The ones she'd loved. The ones that had been marked in her sheet music. I started seeing her then. Not dramatically, not like a jump scare ghost. Just glimpses. A woman in 1940s clothing reflected in the bathroom mirror. But when I turned around, nothing there. The shadow of someone sitting at the piano bench visible through the open door to the sealed room. Always the same woman from the photograph. She never seemed threatening, just present. Visible in mirrors and windows. Always looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sad. Hopeful. Desperate. I found myself talking to her. "I know what happened to you," I said one evening, standing in the doorway of her room. "I know he killed you and hid you here. I'm sorry no one found you. I'm sorry you've been alone all this time." The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I saw her clearly for the first time. Not in a reflection, but standing by her piano, looking directly at me. She was translucent, but detailed. I could see her face, her 1940s dress, the sadness in her eyes. She raised one hand and pointed downward, toward the floor beneath the piano. I called the police the next morning and told them I'd found evidence related to a 1947 missing person case. They were skeptical, but sent someone out. When I showed them the sealed room, the evidence of its history, and explained about Catherine Mills, they decided to bring in ground-penetrating radar. They found her 3 days later, buried beneath the floorboards under the piano. Catherine Mills, missing since 1947, finally found. There wasn't much left after 78 years, but it was enough for identification, enough for her family, distant relatives, great-nieces, and great-nephews to finally have closure. The activity in the cabin stopped after they removed her remains. No more music at 2 a.m. No more glimpses of a woman in mirrors. The room that had held her for nearly 8 decades fell silent. I attended her funeral. They finally gave her one, 78 years late. Her family was there, people who'd grown up hearing stories about their great-aunt Catherine, who disappeared mysteriously. They thanked me for finding her, for finally bringing her home. I stayed in the cabin for the rest of my lease. The sealed room stayed open now, but I couldn't bring myself to move the piano or take down the photograph. It felt wrong somehow, removing the last pieces of her presence. Instead, I left them as they were, a memorial to a woman who'd been silenced but had found a way to be heard. When Lawrence came home from deployment in April, I told him everything. We visited the cabin together, and he stood in Catherine's room looking at her piano, her photograph. "She must have loved music," he said quietly. "She did, and she never stopped playing, even after death, trying to make someone hear her." I learned something in that renovated cabin in West Virginia. Some ghosts aren't trying to scare us. They're trying to communicate, trying to tell us something important. Catherine played her piano every night for decades, the only way she knew to say, "I'm here. I didn't leave. Please find me." And eventually someone finally listened. The cabin is listed as a vacation rental now, and the owner was honest in the listing. She mentions the history, Catherine's story, the sealed room that's now open. Some people are drawn to it because of the history. They want to stay in the room where a woman's ghost played piano for 78 years until someone finally found her body and gave her peace. I still think about Catherine sometimes, about how she must have felt, trapped there, unable to leave, playing her beloved music as the only way to reach the living, about how close I came to leaving without investigating, without finding her. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never cut through that wall, never opened that door. Would she still be there, playing her piano in a sealed room, hoping someone would finally hear? I'm glad I listened. I'm glad I didn't dismiss the music as just old house sounds or my imagination. Because Catherine Mills deserved better than to be forgotten in a sealed room, and she found a way, through music, through persistence, through 78 years of playing the same songs, to make sure someone eventually heard her story and told the truth about what happened. That's what ghosts are sometimes, I think. Not monsters or demons, but people who died with something left unsaid and who'll use whatever means they have, even just the memory of music, to finally be heard. In the Blue Ridge Mountains, I learned that the most dangerous predators aren't the ones that attack immediately. They're the ones that watch, study, and wait until they understand exactly how vulnerable you are. What hunted me on my inherited property wasn't acting on instinct. It was planning. My name is Alonzo Sullivan, and I'm 41 years old. I work in IT, manage servers and networks for a living, which means I'm comfortable with systems, patterns, and logic. When my uncle died and left me 15 acres with a farmhouse in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, I saw it as an opportunity. The property was paid off, the house was structurally sound, and my wife Matilda and I were drowning in city rent. The plan was simple. I'd spend a few months fixing up the place while working remotely, then we'd decide whether to move there permanently or sell it. Matilda worked as a nurse, pulling 12-hour night shifts 3 times a week at a hospital in Richmond. She couldn't take time off, so I went ahead alone in October to assess what needed to be done. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel drive surrounded by wooded hills. The nearest neighbor was about a mile away. Cell signal was weak but adequate. Internet was decent enough for my work. It seemed perfect. The property came with some livestock, a few chickens in a coop, 2 goats in a small pen my uncle had built. I'm not a farm person, but I figured I could handle basic animal care for a few months. The first week was uneventful. I worked during the day, did repairs in the evening, video called Matilda every night. The isolation didn't bother me. I actually enjoyed the quiet after years of city noise. The first incident happened on my 8th day there. I went out in the morning to feed the chickens and found 2 of them dead. Their throats had been torn open, but the bodies hadn't been eaten. They were just killed and left in the coop. The door had been securely latched. I'd checked it the night before. Whatever got in had been strong enough to break through, or had found some weakness in the structure I hadn't noticed. I reinforced the coop, added better latches, checked for gaps. That night, I heard the goats making distressed sounds around 2 a.m. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside. The goats were alive but agitated, pushing against the far side of their pen away from something. I swept my flashlight around the area but saw nothing, just darkness and trees. The next morning, one of the goats was dead, same as the chickens, throat torn, not eaten. And that's when I noticed the tracks. Large prints in the soft mud around the pen, bigger than any dog print I'd seen. Not quite round, more elongated, with clear claw marks. I took photos and sent them to a friend who hunts. He said they looked like large canine prints, maybe a big coyote or a wolf, though wolves were rare in Virginia. But the pattern bothered me. The killings were systematic, not feeding behavior. These were targeted attacks. Something was killing my livestock deliberately, not for food, and each time it was getting closer to the house. That evening, I heard something testing the barn door. I'd closed up the surviving goat inside the barn for safety, and now I heard scraping sounds, the door rattling. I looked out the kitchen window and saw movement. Something large and dark on 2 legs, not 4, standing at the barn door. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with a hunched posture. As I watched, it gripped the door handle and tried to turn it. My blood went cold. This wasn't an animal. Animals don't open doors with handles. This was something that understood human structures, human mechanisms. I turned on all the outdoor lights, flooding the area with brightness. The thing at the barn turned toward the house, and for just a moment, I saw it clearly in the light. Tall, covered in matted hair or fur, with a face that was almost human, but wrong, too elongated, too heavy in the jaw. It stared directly at my kitchen window, at me, for what felt like an eternity. Then it turned and walked into the trees, moving upright like a person. I called 911. The dispatcher took my information, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice. An officer came out the next morning, looked at the tracks, examined the dead goat. He was professional, but clearly thought I was either mistaken or dealing with a large bear. Bears can stand up, he explained. In the dark, they can look pretty human-like. And they're smart. They can figure out latches sometimes. But I knew what I'd seen. That wasn't a bear. I set up my old trail cameras, 4 of them positioned around the property. If something was coming onto my land at night, I'd get evidence. I also started carrying my uncle's shotgun when I went outside after dark. The next night, nothing happened, nor the night after that. I started to think maybe it had moved on, found easier prey elsewhere. But then on the 3rd night, I reviewed the trail camera footage. It was there, multiple times. The first recording showed it at the edge of the tree line at 11 p.m., just standing watching the house. The next clip, at 1 a.m., showed it walking past the barn, examining the new locks I'd installed. At 2 a.m., it was closer to the house, walking the perimeter. And at 3 a.m., it was on my porch. I watched the footage in daylight, my hands shaking. The creature moved with intelligence, purpose. It was learning the property, testing defenses, observing patterns. And in one clip, where it looked directly at the camera, I saw something in its expression that terrified me more than its appearance. Recognition. It knew it was being recorded, and it didn't care. That night, I heard it on the roof. Heavy footsteps walking across the shingles directly above my bedroom. I lay in bed, shotgun beside me, listening to it pace back and forth. It walked the length of the house several times, then stopped directly above me. For several minutes, there was just silence. Then I heard scratching, like it was testing the roof's integrity, looking for a weak point. I called Matilda, tried to keep my voice calm, but she heard the fear. "Come home," she said immediately. "Just leave. We don't need that property." "It's not that simple," I told her. "I can't just abandon this place. And what if it follows me? What if it knows where we live?" "You're being paranoid." But I wasn't. The trail cameras had caught it following me. When I'd driven into town for supplies, I checked the footage later and found clips of it watching my truck from the trees as I left, then watching again from a different position when I returned. It was tracking my movements, learning my schedule. I researched obsessively. Bigfoot sightings in Virginia, cryptid reports, anything that matched what I was seeing. What I found was disturbing. There had been reports in this area for decades. Large bipedal creatures, aggressive behavior, livestock killed. Some reports of people being stalked. One case from 2001 where a hunter had been found dead, killed by something with immense strength. Nothing ever proven, nothing official, just folklore and dismissed accounts. On my 14th night alone, it tried to get inside. I woke to the sound of windows being tested, one after another. The creature was circling the house, checking each window systematically. I'd locked them all, but I could hear it pushing against the frames, testing their strength. When it got to the back door, it did something that made my heart stop. It knocked. 3 deliberate knocks, just like a person would. Then it tried the doorknob. The door was locked, but I watched the knob turn back and forth as something with hands with fingers attempted to open it. I called 911 again, but I was 40 minutes from town. By the time anyone could arrive, whatever happened would be over. I grabbed my shotgun, barricaded myself in the bathroom, the only room without windows, and waited. The trying sounds continued for over an hour. Every door, every window, tested repeatedly. At one point, I heard glass crack, one of the bedroom windows. The creature was escalating, getting frustrated or desperate. Then I heard it on the roof again, and the horrible realization hit me. The skylight. There was a skylight in the hallway, just reinforced glass and a frame. I heard it testing the skylight, pressing on it. I heard the glass creaking under weight. If that broke, it would be inside the house with me. I did the only thing I could think of. I started making noise. I yelled. I banged on the walls. I fired one shot from the shotgun into the bathroom ceiling, making myself seem dangerous, unpredictable, not worth the effort. The sound stopped. Silence for several minutes. Then I heard it leave, footsteps across the roof, and then nothing. When dawn came, I packed everything I could fit in my truck in 20 minutes. I left the rest. I drove straight home to Richmond, to Matilda, to civilization, and safety. When I got there, I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. We hired a property management company to deal with the farmhouse. I never went back. We eventually sold it at a loss to a developer who wanted the land, not the buildings. I don't know if he kept the house or tore it down. I don't want to know. But here's what haunts me. Before I left that last morning, I checked the trail cameras one final time. The footage from that night showed the creature on my porch at 4 a.m. after it had given up trying to get inside. It was sitting on my porch steps, and in the infrared camera image, I could see it looking at my truck, the truck I'd be using to leave. It sat there for over an hour, just watching my truck like it was memorizing it. The next clip was from 6 a.m., as I was inside frantically packing. The creature was at the end of the driveway, partially hidden in trees, watching the house, waiting to see what I'd do. And the final clip, the one that made me sell the property immediately without ever returning, was from 6:47 a.m. as I drove away. The camera at the end of the drive caught my truck leaving, and there, standing in the trees, was the creature, watching me go. And in the clarity of morning light, I could see its face clearly for the first time. It looked almost human. Not quite, but close enough to be disturbing, and its expression wasn't animal rage or predatory hunger. It was calculation, cold, patient calculation. I've done more research since then. There's a theory among cryptozoologists about certain Bigfoot-type creatures showing advanced intelligence, problem-solving, even planning. What stalked me on that property wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. It was something that understood cause and effect, that learned from observation, that made strategic decisions. It killed my livestock systematically to test my responses. It circled my house to learn the layout. It tested my defenses to find weaknesses. And when it couldn't get in, it memorized my vehicle. Some researchers think these creatures have territories spanning hundreds of miles. They remember threats. They remember faces. I still look over my shoulder. When I'm in parking lots, I check to see if anything's watching from the woods nearby. When we camp or hike, I'm hyper-vigilant in a way that Matilda finds disturbing. She thinks I had some kind of breakdown during those 2 weeks alone. She doesn't believe what I saw was real, but I have the footage. Hours of it. A creature that shouldn't exist, stalking me, studying me, planning. I've never shared it publicly because I know what would happen. Ridicule, dismissal, accusations of hoax. But I know what hunted me in those Virginia mountains. And I know it was smart enough to be patient, to study its prey, to wait for the right moment. I got lucky. I left before. It found a way in, before it decided the risk was worth the reward. But I wonder about the next person who buys that land, who lives in that house. Will it come back? Will it remember that property as a place where potential prey lives? Will it be more persistent next time, having learned from its failure with me? These are questions I can't answer. All I know is that in the isolated mountains, there are things that watch us with intelligence and intent. And the scariest thing about a smart predator isn't its strength or its size. It's knowing that it's thinking, planning, learning, and that if you give it enough time, it will figure out exactly how to get what it wants. I'm just grateful I didn't give it that time. Old houses remember the worst things that happen in them, replaying trauma like a broken record that never stops spinning. I spent 3 nights trapped in a Victorian rental where a tragedy from 1962 refused to stay in the past. And every year, on the same weekend, it happens again, whether anyone's there to witness it or not. My name is Trinity Morrison, and I'm 27 years old. I'm a graduate student at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, working on my master's degree in history. I'd been living with 3 roommates in an old Victorian house we rented just off campus. A beautiful place with high ceilings, original woodwork, and rent cheap enough that we could afford it on our student budgets. The house was over 100 years old, built in 1903, and it had that character that old homes have: creaky floors and drafty windows and rooms that felt like they held stories. My roommates were great: Alessandra, who studied biology, Mallory, an art major, and Gracelyn, who was in the education program. We'd lived there together for almost a year without any problems. The house felt comfortable, lived in, normal. But when Thanksgiving week came around, I was the only one who stayed. Alessandra went home to her family in Charlotte. Mallory was visiting her girlfriend's family in Tennessee. Gracelyn had a trip planned with her parents to the coast. They'd all be gone from Tuesday through Sunday. I'd volunteered to stay behind. I had a part-time job at a local bookstore that needed coverage during the holiday week, and honestly, I didn't mind having the house to myself for a few days. I'm comfortable with solitude, and the idea of a quiet Thanksgiving working on my thesis sounded better than traveling. Tuesday and Wednesday were completely normal. I worked my shifts, came home, studied, watched television, enjoyed the unusual quiet of having the entire house to myself. Wednesday night, I went to bed around 11, tired from a long shift but content. I woke up around midnight to the sound of music. Not modern music. This was jazz from the 1950s or 60s, the kind with horns and piano and that particular recording quality that dates it immediately. It was coming from upstairs, from the second floor where the bedrooms were. I was on the second floor, so the music was close, maybe from one of the other bedrooms. I got up and checked. Alessandra's room, empty, dark, no music. Mallory's room, same. Gracelyn's room, nothing. But the music continued, clear as anything, along with the sound of people talking and laughing. Multiple people, having conversations, the clink of glasses, the murmur of a party happening somewhere in the house. I checked the first floor, empty. The music was definitely coming from upstairs, but I'd checked every room. Standing in the second floor hallway, I could hear it clearly. A party in full swing, people talking over each other, someone laughing loudly, music playing. But I was alone in the house. Every room was empty. Then I smelled cigarette smoke. Not the smell of someone smoking nearby, but the lingering smell of a room where many people had been smoking for hours. That stale, heavy tobacco smell that clings to everything. It was strongest in the hallway outside my room. I went back to my bedroom and locked the door, my heart pounding. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe sound was carrying from a neighbor's house. But we didn't have close neighbors. The nearest house was 50 yards away, and I'd never heard their sounds before. Maybe it was some kind of radio interference, something playing through wiring or pipes. That seemed unlikely, but I needed some explanation. The party sounds continued until about 3 a.m., then faded gradually, like guests leaving. Then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Thursday morning in daylight, I searched the house thoroughly. No speakers I didn't know about. No devices that could have been playing recordings. I called Alessandra and tried to explain what I'd heard without sounding crazy. She was concerned but offered the same explanations I'd already considered. Maybe sounds from outside, maybe I'd been dreaming. But I knew I hadn't been dreaming. I'd been wide awake, walking through the house, smelling cigarette smoke, hearing distinct voices and music. Thursday night, I was ready. I set up my laptop to record audio, positioned my phone to record video of the hallway. If this happened again, I'd have evidence. I went to bed around 10, exhausted but determined. The sound started again at midnight. Music first, that same 1960s jazz. Then voices, gradually increasing, the sound of a party building. I grabbed my laptop and checked the recording. It was picking up the sounds, capturing everything. Relief flooded through me. I wasn't crazy. This was real. I opened my bedroom door to look into the hallway. What I saw made me freeze completely. Shadows. Dark silhouettes of people moving in the hallway, cast against the walls by some light source I couldn't identify. I could see the shadows of men in suits, women in dresses, people holding drinks, gesturing as they talked. The shadows moved naturally, like real people at a real party. But when I looked directly into the hallway, there was no one there. Just empty space. The shadows existed without bodies to cast them. I watched in horror as shadow people walked past my door, engaged in shadow conversations, moved through the hallway like it was crowded with guests I couldn't see. The music swelled, and I heard someone laugh, a woman's high, bright laugh. Then another sound cut through everything else, a scream. A woman's scream, sharp and terrified, from somewhere upstairs. The third floor, where there was just an attic space we used for storage. The scream was followed by a horrible thudding sound, like something heavy falling downstairs. Then more screams. Multiple people screaming now. Chaos. The party sounds dissolved into panic. Then, silence. Absolute crushing silence. The shadows disappeared. The music stopped. Even the ambient sounds of the house seemed to vanish. I stood in my doorway, shaking, staring at an empty hallway that seconds before had been filled with shadow people. I couldn't stay in that house. I grabbed my keys, my phone, my laptop, and left. I drove to a 24-hour diner and sat there until sunrise, too terrified to go back. But I'm a history student, and when dawn came, my fear transformed into curiosity. If this was a recording of something that had actually happened, I could research it. I had the date, Thanksgiving weekend. I had the location, my rental house. I spent Friday morning at the university library, digging through old newspaper archives, looking for anything about my address. I found it in the Watauga Democrat from November 25th, 1962. The headline read, "College Student Dies in Fall at Thanksgiving Party." The article described how a 21-year-old student named Liana Chen had fallen down the attic stairs during a party at the house, my house. She'd been attending a Thanksgiving gathering with other students from Appalachian State. Around midnight, she'd gone upstairs, possibly to use the bathroom or to get away from the noise. Witnesses heard her scream, then heard her fall. By the time anyone reached her, she was dead from injuries sustained in the fall. The article mentioned that the party continued for several hours before someone finally called the police. Witnesses reported that many of the guests, shocked and drinking, didn't know how to respond. Some left immediately, others stayed, unsure what to do. The music still playing, people still talking in hushed, horrified tones. It wasn't until nearly 3 a.m. that someone took charge and called authorities. I sat in the library, reading this account, and realized what I'd been hearing. Not just the party, but the exact night Liana died. The house had somehow recorded that entire evening and was replaying it. The laughter, the music, the scream, the fall, the chaos afterward, the gradual dispersal of guests who didn't know how to process what had happened. I researched more and found something chilling. There were online forums where previous renters of the house had posted about strange experiences specifically around Thanksgiving weekend. Hearing parties, seeing shadows, smelling cigarette smoke. It happened every year, every Thanksgiving. The house replayed that night annually, like an anniversary of trauma. Friday night, armed with this knowledge, I went back to the house. I couldn't stay away. My belongings were there. And more than that, I felt like I needed to witness this, to document it properly. If Liana's death was being replayed every year, someone should acknowledge it, bear witness to it. The sound started right on schedule. Midnight, the music began. The party built, voices layering over each other. I sat in the hallway with my recording equipment, watching. Shadows move, smelling cigarette smoke, listening to people who'd been dead or elderly for decades talking and laughing. Then, at 12:47 a.m., I checked the timestamp later. The scream. I was ready for it this time, but it still made my blood run cold. A young woman's terrified scream from the third floor. The thud of her body falling down the attic stairs. More screams. Chaos. But this time I did something different. I walked to the attic stairs and climbed them. The sounds were overwhelming here. People crying, someone yelling for help. General panic. At the top of the stairs, I saw her. Not a shadow. Not a vague apparition. A clear, detailed image of a young woman lying crumpled at the bottom of the attic stairs, her body at an unnatural angle. She wore a blue dress, her dark hair spread around her head. Blood pooled beneath her. She looked exactly like the photo I'd found in the 1962 newspaper article. As I watched, she turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were open, aware. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. She was trying to tell me something. Then she vanished. The sounds faded. The party ended just like it had ended that night in 1962, with guests leaving, traumatized and confused, abandoning the scene of a tragedy they didn't know how to process. I spent the rest of that night researching Liana Chen. She'd been a junior, studying education, planning to be a teacher. She'd been popular, well-liked. Her death had been ruled accidental. She'd been drinking. The stairs were steep and poorly lit. She'd lost her footing. But reading between the lines of old articles, I found hints that not everyone had believed it was an accident. There were questions about a boyfriend she'd been arguing with at the party. Suggestions that she might have been pushed. Nothing ever proven, just whispers and doubts. The next morning, I called my roommates and told them everything. I sent them the recordings, the research, the evidence. They came back early, and we all experienced it together that Saturday night, the final night of Thanksgiving weekend. We sat in the second-floor hallway, all four of us, listening to a party from 1962, watching shadows of people long dead, bearing witness to Liana Chen's death. When the scream came, when we heard her fall, we all said aloud, "We hear you, Liana. We remember you. You're not forgotten." It felt important somehow to acknowledge her, to speak her name into the space where she died. The party sounds faded, as they always did, but this time there was something different. A moment of clarity in the air, a feeling like something had been released. I don't know if Liana found peace that night, or if the house finally let go of that trapped moment. But in the months since, other students have rented that house, and none have reported hearing parties or screams. The anniversary replaying seems to have stopped. I still live in Boone, though I've moved to a different place. But I think about Liana often, about how trauma can echo through time, how places can hold on to terrible moments and replay them endlessly. And I think about how, sometimes, what seems like a haunting is really just a cry for acknowledgement, someone wanting their story told, their death remembered, their life recognized as having mattered. Liana Chen died at 21 in a fall that might not have been an accident. For 63 years, her death replayed every Thanksgiving, witnessed by no one who knew her story. Now her story is told. Now she's remembered. And maybe that's what she needed all along. Not to be feared, but to be heard. If these stories from the Appalachian Mountains have kept you up at night, hit that subscribe button and join the Haunted Fears horror family. Drop a comment below telling us which story disturbed you the most, and don't forget to like this video. We post new terrifying true horror content every single day, so make sure you have notifications turned on. The mountains hold more secrets than you can imagine, and we're just getting started. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that really happened.